Picture a simple piece of parchment covered in the precise lines and arcs of an architectural drawing. At first glance, it looks like the plan for a great cathedral, a place of soaring prayer and quiet contemplation. But look closer. The thickness of the walls is unusual. The placement of the windows is strategic. The layout of the courtyards tells a different story entirely. This is not just a blueprint for a house of worship. This is the plan for a fortress of faith, a bastion of military strategy conceived by some of the most fascinating figures in history, the military monks. For centuries, we have admired these stone giants for their spiritual grandeur, but we have largely missed the hidden narrative of cunning and survival etched into their very foundations. Today, we are pulling back the veil on these architectural masterpieces to uncover a legacy of strategic genius that fused the divine with the defensive, creating a testament to human ingenuity that has stood for 1,000 years. This is the story written not in ink but in stone. It's a tale that begins in the silent scriptoria where monks, bound by vows of poverty and obedience, also held the knowledge of a knight. These were men who understood that to protect the sacred, one must sometimes employ the strategic. Their blueprints were more than just instructions for builders. They were coded manuals of survival, comprehensive documents that reveal a holistic vision where every arch, corridor, and hidden passage served a dual purpose. We are about to explore what these ancient cathedral blueprints reveal about the profound strategic intelligence of these warrior clerics. We will see how sacred geometry was intertwined with tactical foresight, and how spiritual devotion was seamlessly married to martial prowess, creating an enduring legacy that would defend kingdoms. So prepare to see these iconic structures in a completely new light. We are going on a journey from the drawing tables of monastic architects to the very stones that withstood sieges. We will decode the secrets hidden in plain sight, from self-sufficient communities designed to outlast any attack to sophisticated layered defenses that turned a building itself into a weapon. This exploration will change the way you look at medieval history, revealing a depth of planning and a brilliance of execution that rivals any modern strategic doctrine. The stones are ready to tell their true story, a story of faith, fortitude, and a breathtaking intelligence that has been waiting centuries to be fully understood. To truly grasp the revolutionary nature of these architectural plans, we must first step into the world of the individuals who conceived them. Picture a man who has renounced all personal wealth and sworn a life of celibacy, spending hours in devout prayer. Now picture that same man, clad in chainmail, expertly wielding a broadsword to protect a vulnerable traveler on a dangerous road. This seemingly contradictory figure is the military monk, and his emergence in the 11th and 12th centuries created an entirely new social category that defied the established order of medieval society. Before this period, the roles were clear-cut. A monk lived a cloistered life, separated from the world to focus on the divine. A knight was a man of the world, a warrior enmeshed in feudal politics and warfare. The military monk shattered this binary, creating a hybrid identity that was both profoundly spiritual and intensely practical. The two most famous examples, the Knights Templar and the Knights Hospitaller, were born from the turmoil of the Crusades, a time when the journey to sacred sites like Jerusalem was fraught with unimaginable peril. Pilgrims were regularly attacked, robbed, and killed. In response, these new orders arose with a dual mandate that was unprecedented. They took the traditional monastic vows of poverty, chastity, and obedience, committing themselves to a life of religious discipline. But their obedience was not just to a spiritual ideal, it was also to a military chain of command, and their poverty was collective, amassing immense wealth as an organization to fund their sacred duty of armed protection. This radical fusion of the cloister and the castle created a unique mindset, a world view where every problem was considered through both a spiritual and a strategic lens. A Templar knight did not see a conflict between praying in a chapel and designing a murder hole above its entrance. For him, both actions served the same ultimate purpose. This duality became the very engine of their strategic innovation. They were not soldiers for personal glory or territorial gain. They were, in their own eyes, soldiers for God. This conviction lent a powerful sense of purpose and a fearsome discipline to their ranks. Their intelligence was not merely about winning battles, it was about sustaining a holy mission in hostile lands for generations. This long-term perspective forced them to think differently about everything, especially architecture. A standard castle built by a secular lord was designed to project power and protect a noble family. A commandery built by the Templars or Hospitallers was something far more complex. It was a monastery, a barracks, a bank, a farm, a hospital, and a fortress all woven into a single, integrated community. The men who planned these structures had to be masters of multiple disciplines. They needed the piety of an abbot, the strategic mind of a general, the logistical skill of a quartermaster, and the technical knowledge of an engineer. Their toolkit contained both the Bible and the blueprint, and they saw no contradiction in using them together. This foundational identity is the master key that unlocks the true meaning behind every unusual thickness of a wall, every hidden cistern, and every strategically placed courtyard we will discover in their blueprints. So we understand the unique mindset of these warrior monks, but how did that mindset translate into physical reality? The answer lies in the vellum and ink. When we examine these ancient plans today, it is a mistake to view them as simple architectural drawings. We are not merely looking at the layout of a building. We are, in fact, reading a coded manual of strategic doctrine. These blueprints were far more comprehensive than modern building plans. They specified everything with meticulous detail, from the precise thickness of a defensive wall to the exact placement of a hidden water source deep within the foundations. The documents were often filled with a kind of visual shorthand, a series of symbols, annotations, and geometric notations that were fully understood only by the initiated members of the order. A particular mark in the corner of a courtyard might indicate a concealed postern gate for sorties. A specific series of lines intersecting near the chapel could denote a network of listening tubes or a hidden chamber for safeguarding relics or documents. This wasn't just about building, it was about encoding survival secrets into the very plan of the structure. These blueprints represent a holistic vision, a complete worldview captured on parchment. Every single element, from the grandest arch to the narrowest corridor, was designed with a dual purpose in mind. A beautiful, soaring Gothic arch in the chapel wasn't just for spiritual elevation, directing the eye and the soul towards heaven. Its specific curvature and the way it distributed weight also served to create a stronger, more resilient structure capable of withstanding the impact of siege engines. A cloister walkway, meant for quiet contemplation and processions, was also designed with a covered, protected route that allowed armed men to move rapidly across the complex without being exposed to enemy archers. A peaceful inner courtyard garden provided herbs for medicine and food, but its location, often in the most protected part of the Commandery, also ensured a secure food supply during a long blockade. There was no distinction between the sacred function and the strategic one. They were two sides of the same coin, seamlessly integrated by a philosophy that saw the defense of the faith as an act of devotion in itself. These plans were the physical manifestation of the Order's collective intelligence, a living repository of knowledge that was passed down and refined over generations. A master architect in the Templars in the late 13th century wasn't just working from his own experience. He was building upon lessons learned from failed sieges 100 years prior, from structural innovations developed in the Holy Land, and from the accumulated wisdom of countless brothers who had come before him. The blueprint was the vessel for this institutional memory. It ensured that a new preceptory built in the remote countryside of England would benefit from the same hard-won strategic insights as a great fortress in the Levant. This process of continuous refinement created an architectural tradition of incredible sophistication. The men who drew these lines were not just artists or engineers. They were strategists thinking in stone and mortar, planning for contingencies that might not arise for a century. To truly appreciate their genius, we must train our eyes to see beyond the simple lines on the parchment. We must learn to perceive the hidden strategic layers embedded within the sacred geometry, to read the silent language of defense whispered by every wall and every window. Now, let's put that strategic mindset into action by examining the very first principle we can decode from their blueprints: the Commandery as a self-sufficient fortress. If you were to unroll the architectural plans for a major Templar or Hospitaller house, you wouldn't just see a chapel and some sleeping quarters. You would be looking at the layout of an entire self-contained world. The drawings meticulously detail every essential craft and industry needed for life, all contained within the defensive walls. Here, marked clearly on the parchment, are the bakehouses with their massive ovens, capable of producing enough bread to feed hundreds. Right next to them, you'd find the breweries, because a safe, reliable source of ale or beer was crucial when local water sources might be contaminated or cut off by an enemy. The stables are not an afterthought. They are substantial structures designed to house the Order's most critical assets, their war horses and pack animals. And perhaps most tellingly, the blacksmith's forge is prominently featured, its location chosen for both accessibility and security. This wasn't just a place to shoe horses. It was a weapons workshop, an armory, and a repair shop for everything from armor to agricultural tools. The message in the blueprint is unequivocal. From the bread they ate and the ale they drank to the weapons they wielded and the horses they rode, everything had to be produced and maintained within the safety of their own walls. This drive for self-sufficiency points to a brutal, clear-eyed understanding of medieval warfare. The most common and often most effective strategy for capturing a fortress was the siege: to surround it, cut off all supply lines, and simply wait for starvation and thirst to do the work for you. A typical castle held by a secular lord might have supplies for a few months, after which the defenders would be forced to surrender. But a military monastic commandery was designed to break this entire paradigm. By making themselves independent of the outside world, they turned the attacker's greatest advantage into a liability. An army laying siege is itself a massive, hungry organism camped in often unsanitary conditions. They have to manage their own long and vulnerable supply chains, forage for food, and deal with disease and low morale over time. Meanwhile, inside the commandery, life could continue with a surprising degree of normalcy. The monks and their lay brothers would be baking, brewing, repairing equipment, and tending to their animals, all while the besieging army outside grew increasingly weary and desperate. The psychological impact of this cannot be overstated. Watching smoke rise consistently from the commandery's forges and bakeries would be a demoralizing sight for any besieger, signaling that their primary strategy was failing. The fortress wasn't just holding out, it was actively functioning, a clear declaration that the defenders were prepared to wait longer than the attackers could. But of all the resources necessary for survival, one was paramount: water. The blueprints reveal that the management of water was a primary, obsessive concern for these architect monks. You see this in the intricate systems they designed and integrated directly into the foundations of their buildings. Massive, vaulted cisterns were constructed beneath courtyards or within the basements of the strongest towers, designed to collect and store thousands of gallons of rainwater. In some plans, you can trace the subtle grading of surfaces and the network of lead or stone gutters, all engineered to channel every drop of rain into these secure reservoirs. In locations with access to a spring or groundwater, the blueprints show sophisticated, protected wells, sometimes sunk through dozens of feet of solid rock, with their access points located in heavily guarded areas to prevent an enemy from poisoning them. There are even remarkable examples of aqueducts, not on the grand scale of the Romans, but as clever, concealed channels that brought fresh water from a distant source directly into the heart of the complex, often entering through a fortified tunnel. This water wasn't just for drinking. It was for the brewery, for the kitchens, for sanitation to prevent disease, and, of course, for putting out any fires started by incendiary missiles. By securing their water supply deep within their strongest points, the military monks eliminated the single greatest point of failure in any prolonged siege. This architectural commitment to complete autonomy is what truly separates these complexes from contemporary secular castles. It was a testament to their long-term, institutional strategic planning. A secular lord might be thinking in terms of years or a single lifetime, but the orders were thinking in terms of centuries. They were building eternal institutions, and their blueprints reflect that timeless perspective. The ability to function as a closed, self-sustaining system meant that a commandery wasn't just a defensive point on a map. It was a durable, resilient node in a vast international network. It could serve as a secure base for operations, a safe repository for treasure and knowledge, and a beacon of stability in a turbulent world, entirely on its own terms. This principle of self-sufficiency, so clearly etched into their plans, shows us that their strategic intelligence wasn't solely about winning battles. It was about creating a lasting, unassailable presence that could endure any trial, outweigh any enemy, and sustain the sacred mission for generations to come. But the strategic genius of these military monks extended far beyond simply stockpiling resources. Their blueprints reveal a chillingly sophisticated understanding of battlefield geometry, a principle we can clearly identify as layered defense. If you were to look down at a bird's-eye view of a major commandery's plan, you wouldn't see a single, simple wall. Instead, you'd see a series of concentric rings like a stone onion, each layer presenting a new and more difficult challenge for an attacker. The outer wall might be formidable, but directly behind it, often set back just enough to create a narrow corridor, stood a second, sometimes even a third line of defense. This was not redundancy, it was a deliberate multi-stage trap. The entire concept was designed to break the momentum of an assault, to channel and control the movement of the enemy, and to systematically dismantle their forces piece by piece. An army that managed to breach the outer gate didn't find itself in a secure position. It found itself in a deadly, confined space, exposed to a storm of projectiles from every direction. This architectural foresight transformed the entire complex from a static barrier into a dynamic, active participant in its own defense. Nowhere is this principle more brutally evident than in the design of the gatehouse. On a blueprint, this structure is not a simple archway with a door. It is a labyrinthine, multi-chambered death trap, a masterpiece of defensive engineering. The approach alone was often a carefully controlled gauntlet. A narrow, twisting ramp would force attackers to approach with their unshielded right side exposed to the defenders on the walls above. Then came the gate itself, which was rarely a single point of entry. The plans show a sequence of formidable obstacles. First, a heavy, iron-clad portcullis would slam down from above, potentially splitting the attacking force. Behind that, a massive, reinforced wooden gate, often studded with iron, would block the way, but the true horror for any soldier caught in this space was what lay above. The vaulted ceiling of the gate passage was typically pierced with murder holes openings, through which the defenders could rain down a hellish assortment of projectiles. This wasn't limited to arrows. They would pour boiling water, hot sand that could seep through armor and cause terrible burns, quicklime, or even burning pitch. The walls on either side were lined with multiple arrow slits, set at different angles to provide overlapping fields of fire, ensuring that no corner of the passageway was safe. Each of these features is meticulously detailed in the plans, proving that the gate was never intended to be merely a locked door. It was a killing machine designed to annihilate anyone who dared to cross its threshold. This systematic approach to defense reaches its most chilling conclusion in the concept of the killing zone. The blueprints show that the open courtyards and baileys between the concentric walls were not merely empty space for gatherings or markets. Their dimensions, their shapes, and their sightlines were all deliberately calculated for maximum defensive efficiency. When an attacker's force finally broke through the outer defenses, they wouldn't burst into a safe, open area to regroup. Instead, they would find themselves funneled into a carefully engineered trap. This courtyard, surrounded on all sides by the higher inner walls, became what modern military strategists would call a kill box. The moment the enemy entered this space, they would be completely exposed. From the inner walls and the towers at each corner, defenders could unleash a continuous, concentrated hail of crossbow bolts, stones, and javelins. There was no cover, no escape. The very ground they stood on was a shooting gallery. The architectural plan essentially used the shape of the building itself to create a passive, yet devastatingly effective, weapon. The walls acted as both a shield for the defenders and a cage for the attackers, demonstrating a profound understanding of how to use physical space to dictate the terms of combat. This layered defensive system represents a quantum leap in medieval military architecture. It moved beyond the idea of a simple, tall wall and a deep moat. It was a holistic, integrated system where every component worked in concert with the others. The outer wall slowed and weakened the attack, the gatehouse channeled and butchered the leading elements, and the killing zones in the courtyards finished off any who made it through. The blueprint was the master plan for this entire deadly symphony. It coordinated the fields of fire from different arrow slits, it calculated the sight lines from various towers, and it ensured that every square foot of the complex contributed to its defensive purpose. For the military monks who designed and inhabited these spaces, this was not just about brute strength. It was about intelligent, efficient, and overwhelming application of force. They turned their home, their sanctuary, into a terrifyingly efficient engine of war, where the very stones and sightlines were their silent, unwavering allies against any who threatened their sacred mission. This seamless fusion of the sacred and the strategic represents the very heart of the military monastic ethos, a philosophy where every stone served God and the garrison simultaneously. Consider the cathedral nave, that vast, open central space designed to lift the eyes and souls of the faithful toward heaven. In a traditional monastery, this area was solely for prayer and procession. But in a commandery, the blueprint reveals a brilliant dual purpose. The same expansive floor that accommodated rows of kneeling monks during Mass could, within hours, be cleared to serve as a mustering hall for dozens of armored knights and their sergeants. The soaring height of the ceiling, which created such a powerful sense of divine grandeur, also provided practical advantages. It allowed for the assembly of a large fighting force indoors, safe from enemy arrows, and the acoustics meant orders from a commander could be heard clearly by every man present. The spiritual atmosphere of the space, still lingering with the scent of incense and the echo of chant, would have fortified the soldiers' resolve, framing their impending battle not as a mere clash of arms, but as a sacred duty undertaken under the direct gaze of God. The architecture itself reinforced their identity, reminding them that they were not just warriors, but warriors of Christ. High above this multi-purpose nave, the cathedral spires performed their own double duty. To the faithful pilgrim approaching from a distance, these towering stone needles were beacons of hope, pointing unequivocally toward the celestial realm. They symbolized the order's piety and its connection to the divine, but for the military monk on watch, a spire was the ultimate observation post. Its immense height provided a panoramic, unobstructed view of the surrounding countryside for miles in every direction. From this vantage point, a single sentinel could spot the dust cloud of an approaching army, monitor the movements of potential threats along trade routes, or send signals to nearby commanderies using mirrors or flags. The climb to the top was arduous, often via a narrow, spiraling staircase within the thick wall, a defensive feature in itself, ensuring that access was controlled and easily defended. The strategic value of this elevated perspective was incalculable. It turned a symbol of faith into the most advanced early warning system of the medieval world, blending spiritual aspiration with terrestrial vigilance in a single, breathtaking structure. Even the most delicate and beautiful elements of these buildings were conceived with a pragmatic eye. The stunning stained glass windows, which bathed the interior in a kaleidoscope of colored light while illustrating stories from scripture for an often illiterate populace, were also strategically positioned. The blueprints show that these windows were rarely placed at lower levels where they would be vulnerable to breach or provide easy targets for archers. Instead, they were set high in the walls, well above ground level, their intricate scenes illuminated by the sun, but out of practical reach from the outside. The stone tracery that held the glass in place was not merely decorative. It was a robust latticework designed to withstand vibration and even minor impacts. Furthermore, the subjects depicted often carried a hidden, morale-boosting message for the defenders. A window showing Saint Michael vanquishing Satan or David defeating Goliath served as a constant visual reminder of divinely assisted victory against overwhelming odds, strengthening the hearts of the knights who gazed upon them in moments of quiet contemplation before battle. This principle of integrated functionality extended to the cloister, the quintessential space of monastic peace. Typically a square garden courtyard surrounded by a covered, arcaded walkway, the cloister was the center of a monk's contemplative life, a place for reading, meditation, and silent procession. In the Commandery blueprint, however, this serene space transforms into a hub of protected circulation. The covered walkways or ambulatories provided a continuous, sheltered pathway linking all the essential parts of the complex: the church, the dormitory, the refectory, and the chapter house. In times of peace, this allowed the brothers to move between their duties protected from the rain and sun. In times of attack, these same walkways became secure corridors, enabling the rapid and discreet movement of armed men from one defensive position to another without being exposed to enemy fire from the walls or skies. The central garden itself was not just for beauty. It was a physic garden growing medicinal herbs to treat wounds and illnesses, and sometimes even a secure source of vegetables. making this tranquil heart of the community a practical asset that sustained the body as well as the soul. This was not a compromise between piety and practicality, but rather their perfect, indistinguishable union, creating a living environment where every action, whether in prayer or in defense, was part of a single holy purpose. These structures were not just built to withstand a siege, they were designed to prevent one from ever starting. The sheer scale and artistry of a military monastic cathedral were its first and most formidable line of defense, a form of psychological warfare carved in stone. Imagine you are a local warlord or a roving bandit leader, and you crest a hill to see, for the first time, the commandery of a powerful order like the Templars. What you behold is not merely a large building. It is a mountain of masonry, a symphony of stone that seems to defy gravity itself. Its spires pierce the sky, not as if they were built from the ground up, but as if they were descending from heaven. The facade is a tapestry of intricate carvings, saints and angels standing in stern judgment, their stone eyes seeming to follow your every move. The sheer verticality of the design sends an unambiguous message. This is not a place of man. It is an outpost of the divine, a territory under the direct protection of a power far greater than any earthly army. Before a single arrow is nocked or a sword is drawn, the architecture has already begun its assault on your morale, planting a seed of doubt and fear that questions the very wisdom of attacking. This psychological impact was not an accidental byproduct of grand design. It was the calculated intention of the architects. They understood a fundamental truth of human psychology. What is awe-inspiring can also be terrifying. The immense weight of those stone blocks, some weighing many tons, communicated permanence and invincibility. The labor required to quarry, transport, and lift them into place spoke of an organization with almost limitless resources and resolve. An attacker would be forced to confront a daunting calculation. If these men could command such power in peacetime, what unimaginable force could they bring to bear in war? The intricate carvings on the portals and archways served a dual narrative. To the pilgrim, they told stories of salvation and divine justice. But to a potential aggressor, they depicted scenes of demonic defeat and the wrath of God against the wicked. This was a visual warning, a promise of the spiritual and physical consequences of assaulting a holy place. The architecture was performing a constant, silent negotiation, using its own grandeur to establish terms of engagement that heavily favored the defenders. It projected an image of divine favor and unassailable power so potent that it could compel a rival to seek an easier target elsewhere, effectively securing the peace without ever having to fight for it. Beneath this visible grandeur lay a hidden layer of meaning, one that the military monks believed was the true source of their strength: sacred geometry. The blueprints for these structures were not just practical diagrams, they were theological documents infused with precise mathematical proportions and symbolic shapes believed to be divinely ordained. The most famous of these is the golden ratio, a mathematical relationship found throughout nature, from the spiral of a seashell to the arrangement of petals on a flower. To the medieval mind, this was not coincidence. It was evidence of God's handiwork, the fundamental blueprint of creation itself. By incorporating this same ratio into the dimensions of their cathedrals, the relationship between the nave's width and its length, the height of a spire to its base, the architect monks were not merely creating something beautiful. They were aligning their man-made structure with the cosmic order, building in harmony with the laws of the universe as they understood them. They believed that a building constructed according to these holy proportions would literally resonate with divine power, invoking God's protection and blessing upon all who dwelt within. This belief in sacred geometry had a profound and tangible effect on the defenders' state of mind. For the brothers of the order, living and working within these mathematically perfect spaces was a constant reinforcement of their mission's righteousness. The harmony and balance of their surroundings, even if felt only subconsciously, fostered a sense of order, stability, and unwavering faith. It convinced them that they were not just defending a building, but a manifestation of divine will on earth. This conviction bred a fanatical level of morale and cohesion, making them more disciplined and resilient in the face of adversity. Conversely, for a superstitious medieval attacker, the same principles could sow deep psychological turmoil. The unsettling perfection of the structure, its seemingly supernatural stability and beauty, could easily be interpreted as a visible sign of God's favor resting upon the defenders. The mere sight of it could fuel rumors that the walls were protected by magic or divine intervention, that the saints themselves manned the battlements. In an age where faith moved armies, this architectural mystique was a weapon that could break an enemy's will before the first ladder was ever raised against the wall. Ultimately, the entire complex functioned as a sophisticated instrument of non-verbal communication, broadcasting a continuous, powerful signal to friend and foe alike. Every choice in the design, from the raw, intimidating bulk of the fortress elements to the ethereal, heaven-reaching elegance of the cathedral, spoke a silent language of strength, permanence, and heavenly sanction. It communicated to pilgrims and allies that this was a place of ultimate safety and spiritual authority, a bastion of order in a chaotic world. To adversaries, it delivered a starkly different message, that any attack would be not just a military challenge, but a sacrilegious act against a power beyond their comprehension, an undertaking so costly and perilous that it was scarcely worth considering. This was the pinnacle of the military monks' strategic intelligence. They mastered the art of making their very presence a deterrent, using architecture not just to win wars but to make them unnecessary. They built not only to protect their bodies but to dominate the minds of all who looked upon their work, creating a legacy in stone that was as psychologically impenetrable as it was physically formidable. Now let's take all these strategic principles and see them in action by zooming in on a specific, fascinating case study, the Templar Preceptory. If the great cathedrals and castles were the public face of the military orders, the Preceptory was their secret heart. These were not the vast, iconic fortresses of the crusading frontier, but rather a network of regional headquarters spread across Europe, serving as local administrative centers, farms, recruiting stations, and secure waypoints. And their blueprints reveal a masterclass in covert design, where the true genius was hidden behind a facade of calculated modesty. From the outside, a typical Templar preceptory was often designed to appear as a simple, even humble, fortified manor house. It might have a sturdy outer wall, a functional gate, and a collection of unassuming stone buildings, all presenting the image of a prosperous but not particularly threatening agricultural estate. This was the first and most brilliant layer of their deception. In an era where powerful barons built flamboyant castles to broadcast their wealth and status, the Templars did the exact opposite. They practiced architectural anonymity, deliberately downplaying their true power to avoid drawing unnecessary attention or inciting envy from local nobility. To a passing traveler or a casual observer, it looked like just another working farm, a quiet outpost of monks who prayed and tilled the land. This unassuming exterior was the perfect camouflage for what was, in reality, a meticulously engineered hub of military, financial, and logistical activity. But once you stepped through that gate, the illusion shattered. The internal layout of a preceptory, as detailed in surviving plans and archaeological evidence, was a labyrinth of incredible complexity, a carefully orchestrated maze designed for maximum security and operational efficiency. The blueprint was the key to navigating this internal world. A visitor, perhaps a local lord coming to deposit a donation, would be guided along a very specific, controlled path. They would be led from the gatehouse directly to the public-facing areas, maybe the outer courtyard, the guest hall, or the chapel for worship. Their movement was channeled and restricted, ensuring they only saw what the Templars wanted them to see. Meanwhile, the heart of the Preceptory, the chapter house where secret meetings were held, the treasury, the commander's private chambers, and the inner barracks was tucked away in a separate, highly secured section of the complex, often accessible only through a second, interior gatehouse that was every bit as defensible as the main one. This separation between public and private space was absolute, creating a secure inner sanctum where the Order's most sensitive work could proceed behind multiple layers of stone and secrecy. This commitment to internal security is most spectacularly evident in the network of secret passages that connected key rooms. The blueprints show these not as afterthoughts, but as integral components of the design. Narrow, hidden staircases were woven into the thickness of walls, allowing a brother to move silently from the dormitory to the battlements without ever being seen in the open courtyard. A disguised door in the paneling of the chapter house might lead to a concealed listening post adjacent to the guest hall, or to a bolt hole that exited outside the walls. These passages served multiple strategic purposes. They allowed for the discreet movement of personnel, enabling the garrison to reinforce threatened points or launch surprise counterattacks from unexpected directions during a breach. They provided secure routes for messengers carrying sensitive communications between commanders, and crucially, they offered a means of escape or a last-ditch defensive position if the outer walls were overrun. The very existence of these hidden corridors meant that even if an enemy infiltrated the Preceptory, they could never be sure of the ground beneath their feet or the walls at their back, turning the entire complex into a treacherous, shifting puzzle for any attacker. Of course, one of the most famous and sensitive functions of the Templars was their role as early bankers and financiers. Kings, nobles, and pilgrims alike trusted the Order to safeguard their wealth and facilitate the transfer of funds across vast distances. This immense responsibility demanded an unparalleled level of security for their vaults, and the blueprints show an obsession with concealment that borders on artistry. The treasury was never in an obvious location. Instead, plans indicate it was often hidden in the most sacred and, ironically, the most structurally secure part of the complex, beneath the chapel. Access to the vault might be through a trapdoor concealed under the altar stones, or by a mechanism that shifted a section of the decorated floor. In other designs, the wealth was stored behind a false wall in the cellar, a section of masonry that looked completely solid but could be pivoted open with a hidden counterweight. The protection of these vaults was both physical and psychological. To steal from the Templars, one wouldn't just have to breach their defenses, one would have to commit the ultimate sacrilege of desecrating their chapel, an act that would carry not only the Order's wrath but, in the medieval mind, the certain damnation of one's soul. This design reflected their notorious discretion, a core tenet of their reputation. The safety of a client's deposit was guaranteed not just by armed guards, but by an architectural secret so well kept that its location died with the brothers who built it. The overall design philosophy of the Preceptory, therefore, becomes a perfect architectural reflection of the Templar ethos. Their legendary discretion, their role as guardians of secrets both spiritual and financial, is literally built into the stone. The humble exterior concealed a potent military and economic engine. The controlled internal flow of traffic managed information and access. The hidden passages provided tactical flexibility and deniability. And the ingeniously concealed vaults protected the financial backbone that powered their entire international operation. A Templar Preceptory was more than a building, it was a statement of intent. It communicated that true power does not need to announce itself loudly, that the most effective security is often invisible, and that the greatest secrets are those that are so well integrated into the mundane that no one thinks to look for them. In studying these blueprints, we aren't just looking at the plan for a medieval compound. We are reading the operational manual for one of history's most sophisticated and enigmatic organizations, an organization that understood that sometimes the strongest fortress is the one that doesn't look like a fortress at all. While the parchment blueprints give us the what and the how, they are only half the story. The full picture of this strategic intelligence only emerges when we place that parchment onto the actual ground, understanding that the very first and most critical decision was not drawn on any page, but was made by walking the land itself. The military monks were masters of terrain, possessing an almost intuitive sense for how to turn geography into a weapon. A blueprint for a commandery was never a one-size-fits-all document to be stamped onto any flat piece of land. It was a bespoke solution, a custom-fitted suit of armor tailored to the unique contours of a specific hill, river bend, or cliff face. Their genius lay in recognizing that the most powerful defensive features weren't always the ones they had to build from scratch, but the ones that nature had already provided for free. A steep, rocky incline was worth 1,000 laborers. A fast-flowing river was a more reliable sentry than 100 guards. Their architectural plans, therefore, begin not with a foundation trench, but with a deep and respectful reading of the landscape, seeking out locations where the land itself would fight alongside them. This acumen for site selection is breathtakingly evident in the commanding positions they consistently chose. If you were to map the locations of major Templar or Hospitaller commanderies across Europe and the Holy Land, you would see a pattern emerge that any modern military strategist would immediately recognize. They gravitated towards high ground with an unerring instinct. A hilltop or a spur of land jutting out from a mountain range offered a multitude of innate advantages. First and foremost was the sheer defensive difficulty it presented to any attacker. An assaulting force would be exhausted long before they even reached the walls, struggling up a steep slope while burdened by heavy armor and siege equipment, all the while under the watchful eyes of defenders who could see their every move from miles away. This elevated position also provided that priceless commodity we discussed earlier, visibility. From a hilltop commandery, a sentinel could monitor the surrounding countryside for signs of trouble, control the movement on nearby roads, and communicate via line-of-sight signals with other nearby outposts. But the choice of high ground wasn't just about defense and observation. It was also about projection. A fortress perched on a prominent hill was a constant, unavoidable statement of power and presence, a silent declaration of authority over the entire region visible to every peasant, pilgrim, and prince for leagues around. Yet, the strategic value of a location wasn't solely measured in its defensive qualities. The military monks were also pragmatic economists and logisticians, and their site selection reveals a shrewd understanding of the power that comes from controlling the arteries of medieval life. Many of their most prosperous commanderies were built not in remote, inaccessible mountains, but squarely astride crucial trade routes, river crossings, and mountain passes. A blueprint for a commandery at a key river ford, for instance, shows a structure designed not just to defend the crossing, but to dominate it completely. The order could then control the flow of goods and people, ensuring safe passage for pilgrims and merchants who paid for their protection, while simultaneously taxing the commerce that was the lifeblood of the medieval economy. This turned a defensive position into a fantastically lucrative enterprise. The very safety offered by the Commandery's walls attracted settlements, markets, and artisans, creating a thriving economic hub that generated the wealth needed to fund the order's military and charitable activities far afield. The location was thus a dual force multiplier. It enhanced their military security while directly financing their entire operation. Once the perfect site was chosen, the real architectural artistry began the process of augmentation. The blueprints show how the monks didn't just build on the land, they collaborated with it, enhancing its natural strengths with their own engineered solutions. A great example is their masterful manipulation of water. A commandery built on a peninsula, naturally defended on 3 sides by a river, was already in a strong position. But the blueprint would show how the monks improved upon nature's design. They would often excavate and divert a channel of the river to cut across the landward side, transforming the peninsula into a true island and creating a formidable moat that completely encircled their stronghold. This wasn't just a ditch filled with water, it was a controlled hydraulic system. The plans detail sluice gates and weirs that allowed them to manage the water level, potentially flooding approach roads in times of threat or draining sections for maintenance. In more arid regions where rivers were scarce, the blueprints reveal an even more impressive feat: the creation of massive rock-cut cisterns. These weren't simple holes in the ground. They were vast subterranean caverns, often carved directly into the bedrock upon which the commandery stood. By integrating the water storage into the very foundation of the fortress, they protected this vital resource from contamination or capture, while simultaneously using the immense weight and solidity of the natural rock to create an absolutely impregnable lower level. The building and the landscape became one unified defensive entity. This symbiotic relationship between the man-made plan and the natural world represents the highest form of their strategic intelligence. They did not see the environment as an obstacle to be conquered or flattened, but as a partner in their grand design. A jagged, natural rock outcrop wasn't something to be demolished. It was incorporated into the curtain wall, forming a section that was impossible to sap or undermine. A dense forest on one approach wasn't cleared away. It was left standing to impede cavalry and obscure the movements of a large army, while the commandery's own sightlines from higher up remained clear. The blueprint was the mediation point between human intention and geological reality. It was a document that asked not, "What can we build here?" but, "What is this land already offering us, and how can we make it even stronger?" This philosophy resulted in fortifications that felt almost organic, as if they had grown naturally from the hilltops and riverbanks they occupied. They weren't imposed upon the landscape, they were an expression of it, a testament to a way of thinking that understood true strength comes not from battling your environment, but from wisely enlisting it in your cause. The physical blueprints were the master plan, but the men who transformed those lines on parchment into enduring stone were the guardians of a deeper, more elusive secret. These were the stonemasons, and they were far more than simple laborers. Many were actually full members of the military orders, having taken the same vows of poverty, chastity, and obedience as the knights they served. Others were lay brothers or highly trusted secular craftsmen, bound by ferocious oaths of secrecy, oaths that carried the threat of excommunication or worse if broken. Their loyalty was absolute, and their knowledge was compartmentalized, ensuring that no single artisan held the complete strategic picture of the structure they were helping to raise. This created a human wall of silence around the commandery's most sensitive secrets, a living extension of the stone walls they built. The intelligence of the military monk, therefore, was not confined to the scriptorium where the blueprints were drawn. It was alive in the quarries, on the scaffolding, and in the precise strike of a chisel, passed down through a silent, skilled fraternity that understood their work was a sacred and strategic trust. This culture of secrecy gave rise to what we can think of as the stonemason's code, a silent language of symbols and geometries embedded directly into the building's fabric. The blueprint provided the overall form, but the true tactical details were often communicated through the masonry itself, hidden in plain sight for those who knew how to look. A seemingly decorative pattern in the stonework, for instance, might not be mere ornamentation. A specific sequence of interlocking diamonds carved above a doorway could signal the presence of a concealed passage behind the wall. A deliberate break in the pattern of ashlar blocks, where one course of stones was laid slightly differently from the ones around it, might mark the location of a pivoting stone that gave access to a hidden chamber. The code was visual and tactile, designed to be read by the initiated while appearing as insignificant variation or artistic flourish to any outsider or even a low-ranking member of the order. This ensured that the strategic knowledge was physically baked into the Commandery, becoming a permanent, unspoken part of its structure that could not be easily stolen, copied, or destroyed. The principles of sacred geometry we discussed earlier were also a fundamental part of this coded language, but here they served a starkly practical purpose beyond spiritual harmony. The specific angles of arches, for example, were not only calculated for optimal weight distribution and beauty. A series of arches with a slightly more acute angle than the others in a corridor could indicate a sequence leading to a disguised emergency exit. The repetition of certain numerical sequences, deeply symbolic to the medieval mind, also functioned as a practical measuring tool. The number 5, representing the 5 wounds of Christ, might be used to mark intervals. If a particular design element, a carved fleur-de-lis or a specific type of column capital, recurred every 5th stone for a set number of repetitions, it could create an invisible measuring tape that pointed toward a hidden vault or a secure room. The builders were using the divine mathematics of their faith to create a functional, mnemonic map of their own fortress, a map that was invisible to anyone who did not share their spiritual and strategic worldview. This system reached its most brilliant application in the concealment of the Commandery's most vital assets, its escape routes and its treasure. A hidden postern gate, essential for sending messengers or launching surprise attacks, could not be obvious. The stonemason's code was used to camouflage its mechanism perfectly. The keystone of an arch near the kitchens, carved with a particular symbol known only to the senior brothers, might be the trigger that released a counterweight, swinging a massive, seemingly solid section of the wall inward. Likewise, the location of the treasury was often the most closely guarded secret of all. While the blueprint might show a general storage area, the exact spot of the vault, concealed behind a false wall or beneath a flagstone, was rarely committed to parchment. Instead, that knowledge was transferred to the stone. A unique, almost imperceptible variation in the carving of a gargoyle's face high on the chapel wall might align perfectly with a specific crack in the floor stones far below, creating a sightline that indicated the precise location of the hidden trapdoor. The secret was held not in a document that could be captured, but in the relationship between two seemingly unconnected architectural features, a puzzle that could only be solved by someone who had been taught the solution. The ultimate strategic value of this embedded code was its resilience. Imagine a scenario where a commandery was compromised. Perhaps a traitor within the order managed to steal a set of blueprints and deliver them to an enemy commander. That commander would study the plans, learning the layout of the walls, the gatehouses, and the general placement of buildings. He would feel confident that he understood the fortress's strengths and weaknesses. But what those stolen blueprints would not tell him is that the third archway from the left in the refectory conceals a passage to the outer wall. They would not reveal that the decorative rosette in the chapter house is actually a locking mechanism for a secret door. They would not hint that the pattern of tiles in the chapel floor, when stepped on in the correct sequence, opens a shaft leading to a secure underground tunnel. The full defensive and operational depth of the Commandery remained safely obscured, locked away in the silent language of the stones. The enemy would breach the outer walls only to find the defenders had vanished, or would secure a courtyard only to be attacked from a direction that, according to their stolen maps, was a solid wall. The stonemason's code was the final, brilliant layer of security, a testament to an intelligence that understood the importance of protecting not just the physical structure, but the knowledge of how that structure truly worked. It meant that even if the parchment fell into the wrong hands, the soul of the fortress, its hidden tricks and traps remained safe, known only to the brothers who called it home and the loyal craftsmen who had breathed that secret life into the stone. This concept of embedding secrets into stone highlights a brilliant form of defensive planning, but the military monks applied that same forward-thinking intelligence to the very process of construction itself. When we analyze blueprints from multiple sites, a fascinating pattern emerges that goes beyond unique local adaptations. We find a recurring, almost systematic approach to the layout itself, a principle we can identify as modular design. This wasn't about building a single, perfect fortress. It was about creating a replicable, scalable system for empire building. Imagine a master architect for the Templars or Hospitallers not starting from a blank slate for every new project, but instead pulling out a set of standardized templates. The core components of a commandery, the chapel for worship, the chapter house for governance, the dormitory for the brothers, and the refectory for meals were often designed to a remarkably consistent plan, regardless of whether the building was rising in the rainy hills of England or the arid landscape of the Levant. This standardization was a logistical masterstroke. It meant that a team of masons and carpenters, once trained in the order style, could be dispatched to any new building site and immediately understand their tasks, dramatically speeding up the construction process. Pre-cut stone elements and prefabricated wooden components could even be produced in central locations and shipped to new outposts, turning the complex, years-long endeavor of castle building into a more efficient, almost assembly line-like operation. This modular approach allowed the orders to establish a powerful, coherent presence with astonishing speed across vast and diverse territories. The tactical benefits of this standardized layout were immediate and profound for the brothers who lived and fought within these walls. Consider a knight of the Hospitallers who had spent 5 years stationed at a commandery in the south of France. He knew every inch of that complex, the quickest route from the dormitory to the battlements in the dead of night, the specific echo in the chapter house that meant a warning whisper could be heard, the exact turning in the undercroft that led to the secure storerooms. Now, imagine that knight receives orders transferring him to a new posting at a Hospitaller fortress on the island of Rhodes. After a long and perilous journey, he arrives at his new home, a place he has never seen. Yet, as he walks through the gate, a sense of familiarity washes over him. The chapel is in the same relative position. The path to the commander's quarters follows the same logic. The dormitory has the same basic arrangement of beds and lockers. He doesn't need a guide or a map, he is already oriented. In a moment of crisis, such as a surprise night attack, this ingrained familiarity could mean the difference between life and death. He could navigate the corridors in pitch blackness, find his assigned defensive position without hesitation, and coordinate with his new brothers seamlessly. This interoperability was a massive force multiplier. It turned every individual knight from a lone soldier needing to learn a new environment into an instantly integrated component of a well-oiled defensive machine, no matter where in the world he was standing. Beyond the immediate tactical advantages, this modular philosophy was inherently scalable, showcasing a strategic vision that was truly forward-thinking. The blueprints themselves tell this story of planned growth. Instead of drawing a final, rigid perimeter wall, many plans show an initial, smaller compound with clear indications for future expansion. Courtyards were often designed with one side left open or bounded by a temporary palisade, explicitly intended to be replaced later by a more permanent stone wall that would enclose a new section. The layout of buildings was often arranged in a way that allowed for new modules, an additional granary, a second stable block, an expanded infirmary, to be added without disrupting the core functions of the existing complex. This architectural flexibility meant that a commandery could begin as a modest, economically viable outpost and gradually evolve into a major regional stronghold as the order's wealth and influence grew. It was a strategy that acknowledged success and planned for it, ensuring that their physical infrastructure could keep pace with their expanding political and military ambitions. They were building not for the present moment, but for a future dynasty, creating structures that could grow organically alongside the order itself. This approach also had a powerful, unifying psychological effect, reinforcing the collective identity of the order across thousands of miles. For a brother traveling from one end of Christendom to the other, entering a new commandery and finding the same architectural rhythms, the same spatial logic, and the same sacred geometries would have been a profound experience. It was a constant, physical reminder that he was part of something far larger than himself, a transnational corporation with a unified purpose and a standardized way of life. The familiar layout of the chapter house, where the same rituals of daily meeting and discipline were performed, reinforced the order's rules and hierarchy. The consistent design of the chapel, where the same liturgies were sung, strengthened their shared spiritual bond. This architectural consistency helped to forge a common culture among men from vastly different backgrounds: French, German, English, Spanish, turning them into a cohesive brotherhood. The stones themselves preached a sermon of unity and discipline, telling every brother that no matter how far from home he was always home, as long as he was within the recognizable embrace of his order's design. The modular blueprint was therefore more than a construction guide. It was a tool for building a unified, resilient, and scalable international organization, stone by standardized stone. While the Templars became legendary for their financial acumen and military secrecy, the Knights Hospitaller present a different, yet equally brilliant, facet of the military monastic mind. Their very name reveals their core mission: hospitality, which in the medieval context meant caring for the sick, the wounded, and the countless pilgrims who arrived in the Holy Land exhausted and ill. This foundational purpose of healing did not make them passive or weak. Instead, it forced them to develop an architectural intelligence that was, in many ways, even more sophisticated and holistic. Their blueprints are not just plans for a fortress that happens to have a sick room. They are the layouts of integrated military medical complexes where the science of wellness was woven directly into the fabric of defense. To study a Hospitaller commandery is to see a world view where protecting the body from disease was as strategically vital as protecting the walls from battering rams, creating a self-sustaining ecosystem of health and security that was centuries ahead of its time. This unique integration is immediately apparent in the strategic placement of the infirmary. In a typical castle, the sick or wounded would be relegated to a basement or a remote tower, out of the way of military operations. But in a hospitaller blueprint, the infirmary holds a position of paramount importance. It was consistently situated in a location that balanced two critical needs: easy accessibility and maximum security. You would often find it connected to the main chapel, allowing the spiritual comfort of prayers and sacraments to be easily administered to the suffering, but also tucked away within the inner defensive ring of the complex. This meant that patients and medical staff were protected from the immediate chaos and danger of a direct assault on the outer walls, yet they were not so isolated as to be cut off from the heart of the community. The design allowed for the smooth flow of patients from the gatehouse to the treatment areas, while also ensuring that in the event of a breach, this most vulnerable population could be defended as fiercely as the treasury. The architecture itself made a profound statement. The care of the sick was not a secondary duty to be hidden away, but a central, sacred function that defined the entire order's reason for existence. Within these protected infirmaries, the science of medieval medicine was put into practice with remarkable organization. The blueprints often show large, well-ventilated halls with high ceilings, designed to keep the air fresh and prevent the stagnation that was believed to spread disease. There would be separate areas for different kinds of ailments. Surgical cases might be kept in one section, those with contagious fevers in another, and pilgrims suffering from simple exhaustion in a quieter wing. This early form of triage and segregation shows an advanced understanding of infection control, even if the germ theory of disease was still centuries away. The brothers and sisters of the order, who served as nurses and physicians, were trained in a variety of treatments, from setting bones and dressing wounds to creating poultices and herbal remedies. Their medical knowledge, drawn from ancient Greek, Roman, and Arabic texts, was some of the most advanced in the Western world, and the architectural shell they worked within was specifically designed to support their efforts, creating a sanctuary of healing that was as thoughtfully planned as any modern hospital. The source of many of those remedies was never far away, cultivated safely within the commandery's own walls. The herb garden was a standard and essential feature of any hospitaller blueprint, and its location was always chosen with the utmost care. You would never find it in an exposed outer bailey where it could be trampled by invaders or contaminated by siege conditions. Instead, these vital plots of land were almost always enclosed within the innermost courtyards, often adjacent to the infirmary and the kitchen, forming a secure medicinal and culinary hub. Here, in raised beds protected from foot traffic, the brothers cultivated a vast pharmacopoeia of plants. They grew lavender and chamomile for calming teas and sleep aids, sage and thyme for antiseptic washes, garlic for its believed ability to fight infection, and a host of other herbs like mint, rosemary, and rue for everything from soothing stomach ailments to repelling insects. This guaranteed a constant, fresh, and uncontaminated supply of medicine, making the commandery self-sufficient in its health care just as it was in its food and water. The garden was a living pharmacy, and by placing it in the most secure part of the complex, the hospitallers ensured that their ability to heal would remain intact even during the longest and most brutal of sieges. Perhaps the most revolutionary aspect of hospitaller design, however, was their sophisticated approach to water management and sanitation. While other military orders prized water for drinking and for filling defensive moats, the hospitallers added a third critical purpose: hygiene. Their blueprints reveal an intricate network of water channels and drainage systems that seem almost modern in their intent. Fresh water from cisterns or protected springs was not only channeled to the kitchens and fountains, but was also directed to the infirmaries and latrine blocks. These latrines, often built projecting out from upper floors with waste shooting down into a designated cesspit or a flowing stream, were strategically placed away from living and cooking areas to prevent contamination. The plans show carefully graded stone floors and channels designed to carry wastewater away, ensuring that runoff and spills did not create stagnant pools where disease could breed. This conscious effort to manage waste and maintain cleanliness was a direct application of their medical knowledge. They understood empirically, even if not scientifically, that foul smells and dirty conditions led to sickness, and that keeping their fortress clean was a powerful weapon in preserving the health and fighting strength of everyone inside. Their mastery of water was thus a triple-layered strategy. It quenched thirst, thwarted enemies, and most uniquely fought disease, demonstrating a comprehensive view of defense that included the invisible war against microbes. All of these elements, the secure infirmary, the protected herb garden, the advanced sanitation, converge to reveal a holistic worldview that is the true hallmark of the Hospitalers' strategic intelligence. They did not see a contradiction between their mission to heal and their duty to fight. Instead, they saw these as two sides of the same sacred coin. A healthy knight was a more effective defender. A clean fortress was a more resilient one. A well-tended pilgrim would become a supporter who spread the word of the order's charity and power. Their architecture was the physical manifestation of this philosophy, creating an environment where the body could be mended, the soul could be fortified, and the community could thrive, all within an impervious shell of military might. This was not merely a fortress with a hospital attached. It was a single, integrated organism designed for total well-being. In an age often characterized by brutality and superstition, the Knights Hospitaller stand out for their practical, compassionate, and deeply intelligent approach to building a better, safer world, one stone, one herb, and one clean stream of water at a time. All of these elements, the physical fortifications, the hidden passages, the self-sufficient systems, created a powerful defensive shell, but the military monks understood that true control extended beyond what could be seen or touched. It extended into the very air itself. They possessed a sophisticated mastery over the soundscape of their commanderies, turning the architecture into a giant acoustic instrument for intelligence and command. The stone walls, vaulted ceilings, and narrow corridors we've been examining were not just passive barriers. They were actively shaped to control, carry, and conceal sound in ways that provided a decisive strategic advantage. This was the principle of acoustic intelligence, and the blueprints show it was a deliberate, calculated feature of their design. While an enemy was scaling the outer walls, the defenders inside might be coordinating their entire response in near total silence, using the building itself as their communication network. The most brilliant application of this principle is found in the strategic placement of what we can call whisper galleries. These were specific architectural configurations, often involving long, stone-vaulted corridors or carefully angled surfaces in a chapel that could carry the faintest of sounds over astonishing distances. Imagine a scenario where a lookout stationed in the highest bell tower spots movement in a distant forest. Instead of shouting an alarm that could alert the enemy or sending a runner who would take precious minutes, he could simply turn and speak in a low, clear voice into a specific recess in the stone wall. His whispered message, riders approaching from the east, would travel crisp and intelligible along the curved surface of a vaulted ceiling or through a dedicated sound conduit, arriving seconds later in the ear of the captain of the guard stationed in a room 50 yards away. This silent, instantaneous communication was a form of medieval telepathy, allowing for the rapid and secret relay of information that could mean the difference between a successful defense and a catastrophic breach. The enemy, hearing nothing, would have no warning that their approach had been detected and that the entire garrison was now mobilizing in perfect, silent coordination. This control over sound also had a more subtle and perhaps more chilling application: eavesdropping. The blueprints suggest that certain chambers were designed to function as dedicated listening posts. A small, unassuming room adjacent to the main guest hall, for instance, might share a thin, resonant wall or have a narrow, concealed aperture that channeled sound from the larger space directly into it. A brother stationed in this listening post could overhear the conversations of visitors, merchants, or even diplomatic envoys, gathering vital intelligence on local politics, potential plots, or the morale of rival factions. This wasn't merely paranoia. It was a critical security measure for organizations that held immense wealth and state secrets. A visiting noble boasting to his retinue about a grudge against the order, or a merchant carelessly revealing the route of his treasure-laden caravan, could provide information just as valuable as any military scout's report. The architecture gave the military monks the ability to be omnipresent, to hear confidences and conspiracies whispered in what their guests believed was complete privacy. Beyond whispers and eavesdropping, this acoustic design played a fundamental role in the command and control of the complex during both daily life and moments of crisis. The sound of a specific bell ringing from the chapel tower might signal the change of a watch, the call to prayer, or the assembly of the brothers for a meal. But more nuanced sounds could also carry coded messages. The distinct echo of a particular gong being struck twice, then once, then twice again, could be a pre-arranged signal to secure the inner gates, indicating that a trusted party was entering with a prisoner or that a potential threat had been identified within the walls. During an attack, when visual communication might be obscured by smoke and chaos, the acoustic properties of the courtyards and towers became paramount. A commander shouting orders from a central balcony could be heard clearly throughout the inner bailey, his voice amplified and directed by the surrounding stone surfaces, ensuring that every defender understood his role in the frantic ballet of defense. The entire fortress became a resonant chamber, conducting the heartbeat of the Commandery and allowing its leaders to direct their forces with a speed and clarity their enemies could not hope to match. Ultimately, this mastery of the auditory environment created a powerful psychological divide between the defenders and any attacker who managed to breach the walls. For the brothers who lived there for years, the soundscape of their home was a familiar and reassuring language. They knew which floorboards creaked, which corridors amplified footsteps, and which walls carried the murmur of the chapel choir. This intimate knowledge gave them an almost supernatural awareness of their surroundings. An unfamiliar sound, a scrape of metal in the wrong corridor, a cough from a hidden alcove would instantly register as a threat. For an invading force, however, the same acoustic environment would be disorienting and terrifying. Their own movements would be amplified. Their whispered commands to each other might be carried to the ears of waiting defenders, and the strange, echoing silence of the interior, punctuated by the distant, unseen sounds of the defenders moving with purpose, would create a profound sense of unease and confusion. They were not just fighting men, they were fighting the building itself, a structure that seemed to see and hear everything, sharing its secrets only with those who knew its rhythms. This invisible web of sound, so carefully engineered into the blueprints, was the final, pervasive layer of control, ensuring that even within its own walls, the Commandery remained a fortress for its guardians and a labyrinthine trap for its foes. This sophisticated control over sound and information was matched by an equally brilliant mastery of another invisible force, the flow of money. If we shift our focus from the defensive walls to the bustling courtyards they enclosed, we uncover a dimension of the military monastic complex that is often overlooked, its role as a dynamic economic engine. These commanderies were not isolated, austere monasteries subsisting on donations. They were vibrant, strategic marketplaces, and their blueprints prove it. Alongside the chapels and barracks, the plans meticulously detail extensive warehouses, covered market stalls, and even dedicated docking facilities if the site was on a river or coast, all seamlessly integrated within the defensive perimeter. This was not an afterthought. It was a deliberate architectural strategy to turn their greatest expense building and maintaining a massive fortress into their greatest source of revenue. The very walls that provided security also created a monopoly on safe commerce, transforming these spiritual strongholds into the medieval equivalent of fortified free trade zones, where the sound of the blacksmith's hammer was harmonized with the clink of coins and the haggling of merchants. The mechanism for this economic dominance was as straightforward as it was effective: the control and taxation of trade. A commandery built at a key river crossing or along a well-traveled pilgrimage route didn't just sit there passively. Its blueprint shows how it actively managed the flow of goods and people. The main gate functioned as a customs house. Merchants seeking the unparalleled safety offered by the order's walls would be granted entry, but for a price. The blueprints often indicate a designated inspection area just inside the gate, where goods could be assessed and tariffs levied. This could be a tax in kind taking a portion of the grain, wine, or cloth being transported, or a direct monetary toll. Furthermore, the orders didn't just tax passing trade, they became active participants, using their vast international network and the capital accumulated from donations. They would purchase goods in one region and ship them for sale in another, their own warehouses serving as secure storage for these commercial ventures. The commandery's location was its license to print money, allowing the monks to skim wealth from every cart and caravan that moved within their sphere of influence, funding their sacred and military operations with a consistency that feudal taxes or sporadic donations could never guarantee. This economic activity created a powerful, self-reinforcing cycle that amplified the commandery's influence. The protection offered by those formidable walls acted as a powerful magnet, attracting not just merchants for a day, but entire communities for the long term. A traveling merchant knew that within the commandery's outer bailey, his goods were safe from bandits, rival lords, and the general chaos of the medieval world. This guarantee of security was so valuable that it created a gravitational pull. Artisans, innkeepers, and other service providers would settle just outside the walls or seek permission to operate within them, creating a bustling town that grew in the shadow of the fortress. The commandery's bakery could sell its surplus bread to the town, its blacksmith could take on paid work for visiting knights, and its stables could rent space to merchants' pack animals. The initial defensive investment created a thriving local economy, which in turn generated more wealth for the order through rents, market fees, and the sale of its own produced goods. The fortress didn't just dominate the landscape militarily, it became the undisputed economic hub of the entire region, its financial tendrils reaching far deeper into the local population than any secular lord's authority typically could. This architectural strategy reveals a sophisticated understanding of what we would now call economic warfare. The military monks recognized that long-term power was not solely built on the strength of a knight's arm, but on the depth of one's treasury. A well-funded order could afford to hire additional mercenaries, bribe potential adversaries, maintain a fleet of ships, and undertake the years-long construction of even greater fortifications. It could sustain its operations through a bad harvest or a lost battle because its financial foundations were diversified and resilient. A rival lord might raise an army for a single campaign, but the military monastic orders could wage a perpetual war of attrition, funded by the ceaseless flow of commerce through their gates. Their blueprints, with their integrated markets and warehouses, are the physical manifestation of this philosophy. They show that these men were not just warriors and monks, they were early corporate executives, thinking in terms of revenue streams, market control, and long-term financial sustainability. They built a business model in stone where their defensive capabilities were the primary product, and security was the commodity everyone was willing to pay for. Ultimately, the true genius of this design lies in its holistic integration. The financial fortress was not a separate entity from the spiritual and military stronghold. It was the same structure performing multiple simultaneous functions. The same outer wall that stopped an army also protected a merchant's fortune. The same garrison that repelled assaults also policed the marketplace, ensuring fair dealing and preventing theft. The same commander who led prayers in the chapel also oversaw the account books in the treasury. This fusion of purpose created an institution of unparalleled stability and influence. It meant that the Order's mission could continue unabated by the shifting fortunes of war or the whims of royal patrons. Their wealth was self-generated and protected by their own hands, built into the very fabric of their existence. The stones of the Commandery, therefore, tell a story not just of faith and force, but of finance, a testament to a breathtakingly modern understanding that true, enduring power is a trinity of spiritual conviction, military might, and unshakable economic strength. But these principles of sound and finance all relied on one non-negotiable foundation. The building had to remain standing. To ensure this, the military monks turned to a silent, universal language that they believed was the very framework of God's creation, the language of mathematics. This was not the abstract geometry of the classroom. It was a practical, applied science of survival. When we examine these blueprints with a modern eye, we can decode a seventh strategic principle, the hidden geometry of defensive proportions. Beyond the obvious thickness of walls and the height of towers, these architects were employing sophisticated mathematical relationships like the golden ratio and the Fibonacci sequence to achieve something extraordinary. They weren't just building strong structures, they were weaving the inherent stability of the cosmos into the very fabric of their fortresses, creating buildings that were as resilient as they were beautiful, capable of withstanding both the deliberate fury of a siege and the unpredictable violence of nature. The most famous of these mathematical concepts is the golden ratio, a special number approximately equal to 1.618, often represented by the Greek letter phi. This ratio appears throughout the natural world, from the spiral of a nautilus shell to the arrangement of seeds in a sunflower. To the medieval mind, this wasn't a coincidence, it was divine proof. They believed that God had built the universe using these perfect proportions, and that by replicating them in their own creations, they could tap into that divine order and stability. So when an architect monk sat down with his compass and straightedge, he wasn't just drawing lines, he was seeking harmony with the fundamental blueprint of reality. You can see this principle etched into the blueprints in the relationship between a nave's width and its length, or in the height of a spire compared to the width of its base. A chapel designed with these proportions wasn't just aesthetically pleasing to the human eye on a subconscious level, it was inherently, structurally superior. The distribution of forces throughout the building became more balanced. The weight of a stone-vaulted ceiling was channeled more efficiently down through columns and buttresses to the ground. This mathematical intelligence resulted in a structure that could better absorb the tremendous shock of a battering ram or the relentless, rhythmic pounding of a trebuchet, because its very form was in sympathy with the physical laws of the universe. This pursuit of divine harmony had a brutally practical counterpart in the Fibonacci sequence, a series of numbers where each number is the sum of the two preceding ones, 0, 1, 1, 2, 3, 5, 8, 13, and so on. This sequence manifests in nature in the branching of trees, the pattern of leaves on a stem, and the family tree of honeybees. For the military architect, this sequence provided a ready-made formula for scalable, resilient design. The blueprint for a defensive tower, for instance, might use Fibonacci numbers to determine the optimal thickness of the base in relation to the height, ensuring a stable center of gravity that could resist being toppled. The spiraling staircases within these towers, which had to be narrow enough to be easily defended but wide enough for a soldier in full gear to ascend quickly, often follow a logarithmic spiral based on this same sequence, creating a structure that is both incredibly strong and perfectly functional. This wasn't just mystical number play, it was a pre-engineered template for durability. A building constructed with these underlying patterns possessed a kind of organic integrity, similar to the skeleton of a living creature. It could flex and sway slightly under stress, like a tree in the wind, rather than remaining rigid and brittle, which would cause it to shatter under the immense forces of a siege or an earthquake. This mathematical foresight extended to the most exposed elements of the fortress, the angles of the towers and walls. A simple, flat wall is a perfect target for a siege engine. It absorbs the full impact of a projectile. But the military monks, through their geometric mastery, turned their fortifications into deflective surfaces. The blueprints show that towers were rarely simple cylinders. They were often multi-angled or even fully polygonal. The specific angle of each facet was carefully calculated so that it would act like a shield, presenting a slanted surface to an incoming stone or missile. When a projectile struck this angled face, much of its energy was deflected harmlessly away, glancing off the stone instead of transferring its full destructive force directly into the masonry. This is the same principle behind the sloped armor of a modern tank. Furthermore, the corners where walls met were often reinforced with massive, tapered buttresses. These weren't just decorative additions, they were structural keystones designed using geometric principles to redirect the immense weight and lateral thrust of the walls down into the foundation, preventing the structure from bulging or collapsing under its own weight or from external bombardment. The entire fortress became a collection of calculated angles, each one serving to shed force and dissipate energy, making the whole far greater than the sum of its stone parts. All of this geometric planning culminated in the battlements themselves, the fighting tops of the fortress where the final, desperate struggle would occur. This was the part of the structure that had to support the greatest concentrated weight and activity during an assault. Here you would find teams of men, heavy cauldrons of boiling oil or pitch, stacks of stones for throwing, and even large mounted crossbows called ballistae. The blueprint had to account for this immense live load. The mathematical distribution of weight was therefore a critical calculation. The thickness of the parapet walls, the spanning capacity of the stone flooring beneath the battlements, and the support provided by the corbels and arches below were all determined through geometric principles that ensured the structure wouldn't crumble under the very defenders it was meant to support. The crenellations, the alternating high and low sections of the battlement, were also precisely proportioned. The merlons, the solid blocks, were made wide enough to provide adequate cover for a man in armor, while the crenels, the gaps between them, were calculated to be just wide enough to allow a bowman or crossbowman a good field of fire, but not so wide as to expose him unnecessarily. Every dimension was a compromise between protection and offensive capability, arrived at through rigorous application of mathematical intelligence. Ultimately, this hidden geometry represents the pinnacle of the military monks' synthesis of faith and reason. They believed they were building with God's own ruler, and in a very real physical sense they were. the resilience granted by the golden ratio and Fibonacci sequences seemed to them a tangible manifestation of divine favor, a heavenly reinforcement of their earthly walls. For the defenders, this was a profound morale booster. They fought with the conviction that their fortress was not just strong, but sacred, constructed in accordance with the eternal laws of mathematics that govern the stars and the seasons. For an attacker, the same structure presented an unnerving paradox. It was clearly a work of war, yet its breathtaking beauty and inexplicable stability whispered of a higher power at work. Seeing a massive stone ball from their trebuchet simply glance off a cunningly angled tower, or watching the fortress stand unshaken after a direct hit that should have crumbled a lesser wall, could sow doubt and superstitious fear through an entire army. The hidden geometry was therefore a multi-layered defense. It provided physical resilience against siege engines, structural integrity against decay and earthquakes, and psychological fortification for those within, while simultaneously demoralizing those who sought to bring it down. It was the ultimate expression of an intelligence that understood that true strength is not just about mass and might, but about the elegant, invisible order that holds the universe itself together. But all these principles of geometry and sound, of finance and layered defense, were not just theoretical ideals. They were forged in the crucible of conflict, and no single structure better embodies their ultimate test than the legendary Hospitaller fortress of Krak des Chevaliers. Perched atop a 2,000-foot-high ridge in modern-day Syria, it wasn't just a castle. It was the apotheosis of military monastic architecture, a stone giant whose very existence dared any army to challenge its supremacy. While its original blueprints are lost to time, the colossal structure that remains is itself a blueprint, a three-dimensional manuscript written in basalt and limestone that tells the story of its own brilliant design. For over a century, Krak des Chevaliers stood as the seemingly unbreakable bulwark of the Crusader states, a masterpiece of concentric defense that validated every strategic principle we've discussed. Its story is the ultimate case study, a dramatic narrative where architectural genius met its ultimate challenge on the battlefield, revealing both the breathtaking power and the poignant limits of even the most intelligent design. The first thing any visitor would have noticed, and the first thing any besieging general would have cursed, was its position. Krak des Chevaliers didn't just occupy high ground, it was the high ground. The fortress was built upon a massive, natural spur, with its foundations merging seamlessly with the living rock of the mountain itself. This wasn't a castle placed on a hill, it was a mountain that had been sculpted into a castle. Any army approaching it faced a grueling, uphill slog over exposed terrain, their every movement watched by keen-eyed sentinels from the towering parapets. The ascent alone would have sapped the strength and morale of the most determined soldiers long before they were in range to launch a single assault. This perfect alignment with the principle of strategic location was just the beginning. As an attacker drew closer, the true horror of the fortress's design would have unfolded before them. Krak des Chevaliers was the quintessential concentric castle, but it took the concept to a level of perfection rarely seen. It wasn't just two rings of walls, it was a meticulously calculated system of interdependent defenses. The outer wall, formidable in its own right, was studded with massive round towers that provided overlapping fields of fire, ensuring that no spot at the base of the wall was safe from arrow, bolt, or stone. But this outer wall was really just a preliminary obstacle, a sturdy outer shell designed to absorb the initial shock of an attack and break the momentum of any siege force. The true genius and the true nightmare for an attacker lay in the transition between the outer and inner defenses. After somehow breaching the outer gate, an assault party would not find themselves in a vulnerable courtyard. Instead, they would be funneled into a deadly, narrow corridor between the two walls, a nightmarish space that modern historians often call the death corridor. This was the layered defense principle made manifest in stone. From the immensely taller and thicker inner wall, defenders could unleash a hellstorm of projectiles down upon the trapped attackers, who had virtually no cover and no room to maneuver. The entire area was a meticulously designed killing zone, and any force that made it this far was almost certainly doomed to annihilation within this stone trap. Furthermore, the two sets of walls were not independent. They were designed to work in concert. The outer wall was lower, which meant that defenders on the inner wall could shoot over the heads of their comrades on the outer wall, providing continuous supporting fire. This created a devastating, multi-level defensive system that could engage an enemy from multiple heights and angles simultaneously, something no contemporary secular castle could achieve with such chilling efficiency. One of the most famous and cunning features of Krak, a detail that speaks volumes about the Hospitaller's psychological understanding of warfare, was its main entrance ramp. This was not a simple path to a gate. It was a masterwork of misdirection and tactical geometry. The ramp was designed as a long, rising approach that curved tightly around the outside of the fortress. This design forced any attacking force, whether a small raiding party or a full-scale assault column, to traverse the entire length of the wall with their right sides, their unshielded sides, fully exposed to the defenders on the battlements above. In an age where most soldiers were right-handed and carried their shields on their left arms, this was a deliberate and devastating flaw engineered into the attacker's approach. Every step along that ramp was taken under a constant, galling fire that they could not effectively defend against, but the deception went even deeper. The ramp ultimately led to a massive, imposing gatehouse that looked like the main entrance. In reality, this was often a false front, a heavily fortified distraction. The true entrance was a smaller, much more easily defended gate located further along, forcing attackers to waste time and energy assaulting a position of secondary importance while being cut to pieces from above. This was architectural deception of the highest order, playing on the expectations and instincts of the enemy to lead them into a tactical disaster. And then there was the matter of endurance. Krak des Chevaliers was the embodiment of the self-sufficient fortress. Its vast internal storerooms, carved deep into the bedrock, were legendary. Historical accounts and archaeological evidence suggest that the Hospitallers could store enough food, grain, and salted meat within its walls to sustain a garrison of over 2,000 men for a staggering 5 years. Imagine the psychological impact on a besieging army. They would arrive, set up their camps, and prepare for a wait of several months, only to learn that the fortress they were surrounding had enough supplies to outlast them for half a decade. The water supply was equally impressive, consisting of a massive, vaulted reservoir in the inner ward that could hold millions of gallons of rainwater, collected from a sophisticated system of channels and gutters designed to capture every drop that fell on the fortress's extensive roofs and courtyards. This combination of nearly limitless food and water meant that the traditional siege strategy of starvation was utterly futile against Krak. The besiegers would face starvation, disease, and desertion long before the defenders ever felt a pang of hunger or thirst. The fortress was not just a shield, it was a self-sustaining world capable of maintaining its defensive integrity indefinitely, a testament to the long-term strategic planning that defined the military monastic orders. For over 130 years, this stone leviathan defied every army that marched against it. It weathered numerous sieges, its defenses proving themselves again and again against direct assault, mining, and blockade. It became a symbol of Christian permanence in the Holy Land, a monument to the unshakable power of the Hospitaller order. Its reputation for impregnability was so absolute that it seemed to transcend military reality and enter the realm of myth. But in 1271, the end finally came, and it arrived not with a shattering of walls but with a carefully crafted lie. The Mamluk Sultan Baybars, a brilliant and ruthless commander, knew that he could not take Krak by force. Having failed in a previous siege, he understood that the fortress's true weakness was not in its stones, but in its connection to the outside world. He orchestrated an elaborate deception, forging a letter that appeared to be from the Grand Master of the Hospitallers, ordering the garrison to surrender. The letter was delivered to the castle by a trusted-seeming messenger, and the defenders, isolated and perhaps losing hope of relief from a crusader cause that was crumbling around them, made the fateful decision to comply. They marched out under terms of safe passage, and Baybars walked in. The greatest fortress ever built by the military monks had fallen without a final, cataclysmic battle. The fall of Krak des Chevaliers is therefore not a story of architectural failure, but a profound lesson in the limits of any strategy. It teaches us that the most brilliant design, the thickest walls, and the most sophisticated defenses are ultimately dependent on the human element. The fortress was a perfect machine, but it was operated by men subject to doubt, deception, and the shifting tides of geopolitics. Baybars did not defeat the walls of Krak, he outmaneuvered the minds of the men inside them. This event underscores a crucial duality in the legacy of the military monks. Their architectural intelligence was so potent that it could only be overcome by a different kind of intelligence altogether, one of guile and psychological manipulation. The stones of Krak never broke, they were bypassed. This history forces us to acknowledge that while stone and mortar strategy can create an almost unassailable physical stronghold, it cannot, on its own, guarantee victory in the complex human drama of war. The fortress remains standing to this day, a majestic and haunting ruin, its silent stones bearing witness to both the pinnacle of medieval military engineering and the timeless truth that no wall, no matter how well designed, can ever be stronger than the will and wit of those who defend or attack it. For the military monk, every stone laid in defense was an act of devotion, a prayer made physical. This profound fusion of faith and fortification meant that the very orientation of their commanderies was a theological statement. When you examine the blueprints, a consistent pattern emerges. The entire complex is almost always aligned on an east-west axis. This was not a random architectural choice. The altar within the chapel was meticulously positioned in the eastern end of the building, so that during the morning mass, the rising sun would stream through the windows, illuminating the sacred space and symbolizing the resurrection of Christ, the light of the world. This alignment served as a daily, visible reminder of their divine purpose, connecting their earthly struggles to a celestial narrative. But this spiritual decision was intertwined with brilliant practicality. An east-facing orientation captured the maximum amount of morning sunlight, warming the stone buildings after a cold night and providing natural illumination for the brothers' early prayers and duties, reducing their reliance on costly candles and smoky torches. The strategic placement of windows to catch this light also meant that interior courtyards and living quarters remained brighter and more hospitable, directly impacting the health and morale of the garrison. The blueprint in this simple directional choice reveals a worldview where spiritual symbolism and everyday well-being were inseparable, each reinforcing the other in a continuous cycle of faith and function. This theological framework extended to the very justification for their formidable defenses. In the mind of a Templar or Hospitaller, a thick, impenetrable wall was not merely a military necessity. It was a manifestation of divine protection, a literal answer to biblical promises. They might have reflected on passages from the Psalms, such as, "The Lord is my rock, my fortress, and my deliverer," seeing their own stone bulwarks as an earthly echo of God's unwavering strength. When a brother stood watch on the battlements, he wasn't just scanning for enemy movements. He was participating in a sacred vigil, acting as a guardian of a divinely sanctioned stronghold. This belief system transformed the psychological landscape of a siege. For a secular defender, a prolonged assault might lead to despair, a calculation of dwindling supplies and growing casualties. But for the military monk, the same circumstances were a test of faith, an opportunity to witness God's deliverance. Their unshakable conviction that they were fighting on the side of heaven, that their walls were blessed and their cause was holy, forged a morale that was nearly unbreakable. This provided a strategic advantage that no siege engine could counter. An army could breach a wall, but it could not breach the absolute certainty in the heart of a defender who believed, with every fiber of his being, that God himself stood with him on the ramparts. This fusion of purpose reached its ultimate expression in the act of defense itself. For these warrior monks, drawing a sword to protect the Commandery was as much a spiritual duty as kneeling in prayer. There was no conflict between the two. They were two sides of the same sacred coin. Defending the fortress was synonymous with defending the faith, protecting the pilgrims who sought refuge within, and safeguarding the holy relics entrusted to their care. This mindset created a powerful feedback loop. The spiritual intensity of their mission fueled their military resolve, and their military successes were interpreted as divine validation of their spiritual path. A victorious defense was not just a tactical win, it was a miracle, a sign of God's favor that further cemented their faith and solidified their reputation. This unbreakable spirit meant that a military monastic garrison would fight with a tenacity and a willingness to sacrifice that often bewildered and demoralized their adversaries. They were not mercenaries fighting for pay, nor feudal levies serving an obligation to a local lord. They were soldiers of Christ, and for them, death in defense of their holy fortress was not a tragedy, but a martyrdom, a direct passage to eternal reward. This transcendent morale was, in the end, a strategic asset as vital as any store of grain or cache of weapons, a force multiplier that could tip the scales in the most desperate of situations, turning a likely defeat into a legendary stand. And so, the very systems of secrecy that protected these orders for centuries ultimately contributed to the shattering of their knowledge. When King Philip IV of France moved against the Knights Templar in 1307, his agents weren't just seizing treasure, they were systematically dismantling an intelligence network. The sudden arrest of thousands of brothers across Europe severed the living chain of oral tradition and practical knowledge that no blueprint could ever fully capture. The meticulously maintained archives in the Paris Temple were confiscated, their contents either destroyed, repurposed, or scattered to the winds. Other orders, like the Hospitallers, survived but entered a long period of gradual decline, retreating first to Rhodes and then to Malta, their focus shifting from a vast network of commanderies to the defense of a single island fortress. In this slow retreat, the specialized knowledge of how to build those sprawling, self-sufficient complexes, the understanding of sacred geometry for defense, the secret meanings behind stonework patterns, the precise engineering of acoustic conduits began to fade. The master architect monks died without apprentices to whom they could pass on the entirety of their craft, and the blueprints they left behind, if they survived at all, became silent, cryptic relics, their deepest strategic contexts lost forever. This immense loss is the very soil from which modern mysteries grow. The absence of definitive knowledge has created a vacuum, a fertile ground for speculation, legend, and relentless research. The popular image of the Templars, for instance, is now shrouded in tales of hidden treasures, the Holy Grail, and secret societies surviving in the shadows. While much of this is the stuff of fiction, it is fueled by a genuine historical reality. We know they were incredibly sophisticated, we know they were abruptly silenced, and we know that much of their documented wisdom simply vanished. This tantalizing combination invites us to fill in the blanks with our imagination. But beyond the sensationalism, a more serious, scholarly pursuit continues. Historians, archaeologists, and materials scientists are engaged in a kind of intellectual detective work, attempting to reconstruct this lost intelligence from two primary sources: the silent testimony of the ruins themselves and the few, precious fragments of documentation that escaped the bonfires of the 14th century. The physical remains of a derelict commandery are a puzzle waiting to be solved. An archaeologist examining the foundation stones of a Templar preceptory in the English countryside might notice a curious pattern in the way the mortar was mixed, a specific aggregate that made it more resistant to water, a secret recipe lost to time. The layout of a collapsed hospitaller infirmary in the Holy Land, when carefully mapped with laser scanners, might reveal a subtle, previously unnoticed gradient in the floor, designed to channel spilled water and blood towards a drainage channel for hygiene, a detail no surviving written account ever mentions. By analyzing the wear patterns on flagstones, experts can deduce the daily flow of traffic, revealing which corridors were used most frequently and therefore which were likely the main arteries of the complex. The very weathering on stones can tell a story, showing which walls faced the prevailing winds and rain, and how the builders compensated for this environmental stress with thicker construction or specialized coatings. Each tumbled block and overgrown foundation is a word in a fragmented language, and modern technology is giving us new ways to listen. Alongside the stones, the hunt for documentary evidence is a global treasure hunt. A researcher might spend years sifting through dusty archives in a European library, hoping to find a forgotten cartulary, a bound volume of charters and deeds that contains a copied fragment of a building contract or a financial record mentioning the purchase of lead for plumbing or specific tools for the masons. The discovery of a single, previously unknown ledger entry can sometimes provide the key to understanding an entire architectural feature. In other cases, knowledge survived in unexpected places. When the Templars were dissolved, many of their properties were transferred to the Knights Hospitaller. In the chaos, some local commandery records were simply absorbed into the Hospitaller archives, where they lay forgotten for centuries. The painstaking work of cross-referencing these scattered documents, of matching a mention of a new gatehouse in a financial role with the actual archaeological remains of a gatehouse at a specific site, allows historians to slowly, painstakingly reassemble the puzzle. It is a process of connecting dots across time and space, where a document from a Vatican archive might finally explain a peculiar architectural feature in a ruin in Scotland. The enduring fascination with these military monks, the fact that we are still piecing together their methods so many centuries later, is perhaps the greatest testament to the sheer depth and sophistication of their original strategic intelligence. Their legacy is not just in the grand, imposing castles that still dominate skylines, but in the countless small, clever innovations we are only now rediscovering. It forces us to reconsider the very definition of intelligence in the medieval world. This wasn't just about brute strength or simple piety. It was about a holistic, systems-based approach to problem-solving that integrated spirituality, military science, economics, and environmental engineering into a single, coherent philosophy. The fact that their creations continue to challenge our understanding and inspire our curiosity centuries after their fall speaks to a level of genius that we have yet to fully measure. Their silent stones and lost blueprints pose a continuous, humbling question to the modern world. With all our technology and knowledge, could we build something today that would so captivate and mystify the people of 1,000 years from now? While the soaring battlements and intricate killing zones speak to a genius for immediate defense, the true depth of the military monastic mind is revealed not in how they planned for a siege, but in how they planned for the next century. These commanderies were not temporary outposts or campaign tents. They were permanent communities, dynasties in stone, designed from the foundation up to endure for hundreds of years. This required a different kind of strategy altogether, one that looked beyond the clash of arms to the silent, gradual challenges of feeding a population, maintaining a building, and preserving a way of life across generations. When we examine their blueprints with this lens, we uncover a ninth, profoundly forward-thinking principle: sustainability and long-term occupation. The plans show an acute, almost modern environmental consciousness, where the fortress was not just a shield, but a living, breathing organism integrated with the land that sustained it. This philosophy of permanence is vividly illustrated in the treatment of the very land enclosed by their walls. The outer baileys, those large courtyards between the defensive rings, were not merely empty spaces for mustering troops or drilling soldiers. The blueprints often designate these areas as cultivated land, but this was not haphazard gardening. The plans indicate a systematic approach to agriculture, with fields laid out in long, regimented strips, strongly suggesting the practice of crop rotation. This was a revolutionary concept for a military installation. Instead of exhausting the soil by planting the same crop year after year, they would cycle through grains like wheat and barley with nitrogen-fixing legumes such as peas and beans. This careful stewardship ensured that the soil remained fertile and productive decade after decade, providing a reliable, internal source of flour and bread that was immune to the failure of external harvests or the destruction of surrounding farmland by an enemy army. The fortress was literally feeding itself from within its own defenses, turning its defensive perimeter into a sustainable breadbasket. This same ingenious use of space extended to what might seem like a purely defensive feature, the moat. While its primary function was to hinder attackers and prevent tunneling, the military monks saw its potential for another, more nourishing purpose. In many commanderies, particularly those with a reliable water source, the moat was transformed into a productive fish farm. The blueprints would detail sluice gates and channels to manage water levels and flow, creating a controlled aquatic environment. They would stock these moats with fish like carp or pike, species that could thrive in a confined space. This provided a constant, renewable source of protein that required very little maintenance once established. On a Friday, when the Catholic faith forbade the eating of meat, the brothers could simply cast a net into their moat for a fresh, sustainable meal. This practice exemplifies their holistic mindset. Every single element of the complex, even the ditch designed to stop an army, was expected to perform multiple life-sustaining functions, contributing to the long-term health and autonomy of the community. Beyond the walls, the orders exercised a form of strategic resource management that would be the envy of any modern forester. The blueprints for larger commanderies often include maps and charters detailing vast tracts of surrounding woodland that were officially under the order's control. These were not wild, untamed forests, but carefully managed ecosystems. The woods were divided into sections with a rigorous system of coppicing in place. Coppicing involves cutting trees like willow or chestnut down to their stumps, which then regrow multiple new, straight shoots. This provided a perpetual, sustainable harvest of poles for construction, tool handles and firewood without ever having to kill the parent tree. Larger, mature oaks and pines were reserved for major construction projects, repairing a roof, rebuilding a siege-damaged wall, or expanding the commandery itself. Furthermore, these managed forests were also protected game reserves. They provided a controlled habitat for deer, boar, and other game animals, offering a source of fresh meat through regulated hunting, while also preserving the biodiversity of the region. This was not exploitation. It was a symbiotic relationship with the environment, ensuring that the resources needed for survival and construction would be available for the next generation of brothers and the generation after that. This long-term perspective fundamentally altered the strategic calculus of a siege in their favor. A typical medieval castle might hold a few months of supplies, forcing a race against time for both defender and attacker. But a fully realized military monastic commandery, with its rotating crops, fish-stocked moat, and managed forests, could sustain itself for years, even decades if necessary. This turned their defensive strength into an overwhelming strategic advantage. An invading army camped outside the walls had to rely on long, vulnerable supply lines stretching back to their own territory. These convoys were susceptible to bad weather, bandits, and interdiction by the Order's own cavalry. The besiegers themselves would quickly strip the local countryside bare of food and firewood, leading to hunger, disease, and plummeting morale within their own camp. Meanwhile, inside the commandery, life could proceed with a remarkable degree of normalcy. The rhythm of planting and harvest continued, the fish grew fat in the moat, and the coppiced woods provided a steady supply of fuel. The psychological impact on the attackers, watching their enemies thrive behind those implacable walls, must have been devastating. The siege was no longer a test of short-term endurance. It was a war of attrition that the commandery, by design, was almost guaranteed to win. Ultimately, this commitment to sustainability reveals a strategic foresight that feels strikingly contemporary. The military monks were thinking in terms of carbon footprints and supply chain resilience centuries before those terms existed. They understood that true power was not just about winning a battle, but about creating a system so robust, so self-reliant, and so deeply integrated with its environment that it could withstand the shocks of war, politics, and time itself. Their blueprints show a profound understanding that a fortress is only as strong as the community it shelters, and a community cannot survive on stone and steel alone. It needs bread, it needs fish, it needs timber, and it needs the wisdom to manage these resources not for a single campaign, but for 100 campaigns across a dozen generations. In an age often characterized by short-sighted conquest and plunder, these warrior monks stand apart as stewards of the future, building a legacy in wood, water, and wheat that was every bit as formidable and enduring as their legendary walls of stone. So who were these masterminds, these individuals capable of dreaming such complex structures into existence? They were not just architects, and they were certainly not just monks. They were a unique hybrid, a fusion of disciplines that the world would not see again on such a scale until the Renaissance, yet they were flourishing in the High Middle Ages. Typically, they were high-ranking members of the order, men who had risen through the ranks not only through piety and martial prowess, but through a demonstrable genius for synthesis. Their minds were living libraries, holding a deep and working knowledge of theology, military strategy, engineering, and the sacred science of geometry. They were, in essence, the ultimate generalists in a world that was not yet specialized, and this holistic education was their greatest weapon. They did not see a wall as just a wall, or a garden as just a garden. They perceived the world as a web of interconnected systems where every element had multiple, overlapping purposes. A buttress was not merely an architectural support. It was a physical prayer, a structural necessity, and a defensive bulwark, all conceived as a single, unified idea. This ability to hold multiple perspectives in their mind at once, to see the spiritual, the practical, and the strategic implications of a single stone's placement, was the very engine that drove their most breathtaking innovations. This cross-disciplinary intelligence meant that the design process was a continuous conversation between different fields of knowledge. Consider the challenge of a chapter house, the administrative heart of the Commandery where the brothers met daily for discussion, discipline, and planning. A purely military mind might design it as a secure, defensible bunker. A purely theological mind might design it as a serene, contemplative space reminiscent of a monastery. But the architect-monk saw both needs as inseparable. He would therefore design a chapter house with thick, defensible walls and a secure, single entrance, but he would also ensure it had exceptional acoustics so that every brother could hear the day's readings and instructions clearly. He would orient its windows to catch the morning light, illuminating the space for practical purposes while symbolizing the light of divine wisdom. He would even consider the materials underfoot, choosing stone that was durable enough for armored men to tread upon daily, yet arranged in a geometric pattern that quietly reinforced the order and harmony of their rule. The final design was a perfect synthesis, a space that was simultaneously a fortress, a monastery, and a corporate boardroom, because the man who conceived it was all of those things at once. To understand the sheer breadth of their knowledge, we need to walk in their shoes for a moment. Their education began, as all monastic education did, with the trivium, grammar, logic, and rhetoric. This trained them to think clearly, argue persuasively, and communicate complex ideas with precision, skills utterly essential for directing large construction projects and justifying massive expenditures to their superiors. Then came the quadrivium: arithmetic, geometry, music, and astronomy. This was the STEM curriculum of the medieval world. Arithmetic was crucial for managing the immense budgets and logistical supply chains for materials. Geometry, as we've seen, was the language of God and the tool for stable construction. Music was deeply connected to the mathematical harmonies of the universe and the acoustics of their sacred spaces. Astronomy was necessary for correctly orienting their churches and for calculating the liturgical calendar. On top of this formidable intellectual foundation, they layered practical, hands-on military experience. They knew from personal combat how an attacker would think, where they would focus their assault, and what kind of defensive features would be most demoralizing. They understood logistics, supply lines, and the importance of controlling terrain. Finally, all of this was underpinned by a profound and unwavering theological conviction, which provided the ultimate why for everything they built. This was not a shallow dabbling in different subjects. It was a deep, integrated mastery that allowed them to draw connections that a specialist would never see. This unique synthesis is what allowed them to solve problems in ways that still astonish us today. A brilliant example is their approach to water management, which we've touched on, but viewed through the lens of the architect-monk, it becomes even more remarkable. A theologian monk would value water for baptism and ritual cleansing. A military strategist monk would value it for filling moats and surviving sieges. A medical monk, particularly in the Hospitaller tradition, would value it for hygiene and healing. The architect-monk, synthesizing all these roles, designed water systems that served every purpose simultaneously. He would channel fresh water first to the fountain in the cloister, a symbol of spiritual purity, then direct the overflow to the infirmary for washing wounds and the kitchens for cooking. From there, the runoff would be used to flush the latrines, a critical sanitary measure, before finally being channeled into the moat, where it served the dual purpose of defense and potentially supporting fish farms. A single stream of water, guided by one holistic intelligence, thus became a multi-tool that sustained the spirit, the body, the community's health, and the fortress's security. This was not just engineering, it was a form of alchemy, transforming a simple natural resource into a liquid manifestation of their entire worldview. The legacy of the architect monk is a powerful testament to a timeless truth. The most powerful and innovative strategies almost always emerge from the synthesis of diverse fields. They did not see themselves as applying military strategy to architecture or adding theology to engineering. In their minds, these disciplines were not separate. They were simply different facets of a single divine reality that they were tasked with understanding and embodying in stone. Their blueprints are therefore more than just building plans. They are fossilized thought processes, capturing the moment where prayer met physics, where strategy met spirituality, and where the calculation of a defensive angle was inseparable from the contemplation of a sacred proportion. In an age of increasing specialization, their example stands as a profound reminder that true genius often lies not in knowing more and more about less and less, but in having the courage and the capacity to connect the seemingly unconnected, to build bridges between different islands of knowledge, and in doing so, to create something entirely new, enduring, and truly magnificent. Beyond the formidable walls and cunningly designed corridors, the military monks waged a silent, invisible war using one of the most fundamental forces of nature, light itself. Their architectural mastery extended to a sophisticated understanding of illumination, transforming their commanderies into dynamic theaters of contrast where light and shadow were not mere environmental conditions, but active participants in the defense. When we scrutinize the blueprints, we see this principle etched into the precise placement of every window, every arrow slit, and every strategic opening. These were not random perforations in the stone, they were calculated apertures designed to control the flow of light with the same deliberate intent as a general positioning his troops on a battlefield. The goal was to master the visual field, to dictate what could be seen, by whom, and from where, creating a decisive advantage for the defenders while plunging their enemies into a disorienting world of glare and gloom. This manipulation of light began with the most fundamental defensive feature, the arrow slit. To the untrained eye, an arrow slit is just a narrow vertical opening in a wall. But the blueprints reveal it as a masterpiece of optical engineering. Its design evolved significantly over time, from a simple, straight cut to a cruciform shape that allowed for a wider field of horizontal fire, and eventually to the highly sophisticated fish-tailed or keyhole slit. This design featured a wide, splayed opening on the inside of the wall that narrowed dramatically to a thin, vertical line on the outside. The strategic genius of this shape is twofold. For the defender standing in the relative darkness of the tower's interior, the splayed opening provided a broad field of vision and fire, allowing him to track targets across a wide arc without moving. He was shrouded in deep shadow, making him an incredibly difficult target to spot and hit from the sunlit exterior. Conversely, for an attacker outside looking in, the arrow slit appeared as nothing more than a thin, dark line, almost impossible to shoot an arrow through with any accuracy. The defender enjoyed a panoramic view from his dark vantage point, while the attacker was staring into what amounted to a visual black hole, a tiny slit that concealed the armed man waiting patiently behind it. This principle of backlighting was applied on a grand scale throughout the commandery's interior spaces. The architects deliberately created environments where the defenders always operated from a position of visual superiority. In long, vaulted hallways and stairwells, The primary light sources, whether windows or cresset lamps holding burning pitch, were positioned behind the expected defensive positions. A line of knights holding a corridor would have the light at their backs, their forms casting long, intimidating shadows down the passageway toward any approaching enemy. This backlighting effect would silhouette the attackers, making them perfectly visible and easy targets for crossbowmen stationed inside passages or on overlooking balconies. Meanwhile, the defenders' own faces and the details of their armor would be lost in shadow, rendering them anonymous, formidable silhouettes. This wasn't just a physical barrier, it was a psychological one. Advancing down a dark corridor toward a line of unseen, shadowy figures, backlit by flickering torchlight, would be a terrifying experience. The architecture was manipulating perception, making the defenders appear larger, more numerous, and more demonic, sapping the invaders' courage with every cautious step forward. The strategic creation of shadow extended far beyond simply leaving areas unlit. The blueprints show a deliberate effort to engineer deep, permanent pools of darkness in key strategic locations. Overhanging parapets on the battlements, for instance, were designed not just to provide cover from missiles dropped from above, but to cast a continuous shroud of shadow over the defenders walking the wall walks below. This made them harder to target from a distance. Vaulted ceilings in gatehouses and entry tunnels were intentionally left without light sources, creating a zone of impenetrable darkness that concealed the true depth of the passage and any obstacles or killing pits within. These areas of deep shadow served as perfect ambush points. A handful of defenders could lie in wait in total concealment, allowing an enemy force to pass by before attacking them from behind and sealing their fate in a deadly trap. Furthermore, these shadows were used to hide the Commandery's most sensitive defensive mechanisms: the counterweights for a portcullis, the winches for a drawbridge, or the reserves of quicklime and boiling oil might be stored in recessed, unlit alcoves, protecting them from enemy projectiles and keeping their exact location a secret from anyone who did not know the fortress's intimate layout. This control over illumination reached its most dynamic and psychologically potent phase during a night attack. When an enemy force attempted a nocturnal assault, the Commandery did not blaze like a beacon, illuminating itself for the attackers. Instead, the defenders engaged in a carefully choreographed dance of light and shadow, a form of visual warfare designed to confuse and terrify. Torches and lamps were not lit uniformly. They would be ignited in a sequence, creating the illusion of movement and suggesting that defenders were massing in one location while the real counter-attack was forming in another. A single torch might be placed at the far end of an empty courtyard, drawing the attention of invaders while crossbowmen, hidden in the deep shadows of the surrounding cloisters, took aim. The flickering, unpredictable light from these limited sources would cast wildly moving, distorted shadows, making it difficult for attackers to judge distances, identify friend from foe in the chaos, or discern real threats from phantoms conjured by the dancing flames. For the brothers who knew the fortress intimately, this was a familiar, navigable environment. For the invaders, it was a shifting, malevolent labyrinth where every shadow could conceal a blade and every flicker of light could be a fatal distraction. The very air they moved through became an adversary, a medium of disinformation and fear engineered by the unseen architects who had planned for this moment decades or even centuries before. The true power of the military monastic orders did not reside in any single formidable commandery, but in the invisible threads that bound them together into a single, breathing entity. Each fortress, no matter how imposing, was fundamentally a node in a vast international network, a medieval prototype of a distributed intelligence system. While the blueprints for each site were uniquely tailored to its local terrain and strategic role, they all shared a common architectural language designed specifically to facilitate this connectivity. This was not a loose alliance of independent castles. It was a highly organized corporate enterprise whose operational manual was written in stone and standardized design. The Commandery's strength was multiplied exponentially by its connection to its siblings, creating a defensive and informational web that spanned continents and could respond to a crisis with a speed and coordination that secular lords could scarcely comprehend. This interconnectedness was physically manifested in the blueprints through the consistent inclusion of dedicated signaling points. If you were to examine the plans for a dozen different commanderies from England to Jerusalem, you would find the same feature marked on the highest and most strategically positioned tower, a designated platform for visual communication. This was the medieval equivalent of a network router. From these vantage points, operators could send complex messages across astonishing distances using a sophisticated language of light and movement. During the day, they employed a system of semaphore with large, brightly colored flags. Specific positions and motions of these flags could convey pre-arranged signals: armed band sighted, request reinforcements, or supply convoy arrived. At night, this system switched to a binary code of fire and shadow. A shielded lantern or a carefully controlled fire in a brazier could be used to send flashes of light, a short flash, a long hold mimicking the dots and dashes of Morse code centuries before its invention. On a clear day, a message could be relayed from one hilltop commandery to the next, hop-scotching across the landscape at the speed of light, covering in minutes a distance that would take a rider on horseback an entire day. But light-based communication had its limits. It required line of sight and fair weather. For longer distances or more complex intelligence, the network relied on its most vital component, the courier. The blueprints reveal how these human data packets were seamlessly integrated into the commandery's daily operation. The layouts consistently show secure, well-appointed stables located near the gatehouse, but separated from the main garrison's horses. These were the relay stations for the Order's communication corps. A courier arriving on a lathered horse would be able to swiftly stable his mount in a designated spot and have it cared for by a specialized groom, while he himself proceeded to dedicated guest quarters reserved exclusively for messengers. These were not luxurious accommodations, but they were secure, comfortable, and most importantly, efficient. A courier could rest, eat a hot meal, and then depart on a fresh, pre-saddled horse with his sealed message, having lost only a minimal amount of time. This system of relay stations and fresh horses meant that urgent dispatches could travel at a pace that was unheard of in the secular world, allowing the central leadership of the Order in Paris or Jerusalem to make decisions based on intelligence that was merely days old, rather than weeks or months. This high-speed network transformed the strategic capabilities of the Orders, enabling a level of coordinated response that was otherwise impossible. Imagine a scenario where a Templar preceptory in a remote region of France came under threat from a local baron. The moment the threat was identified, the commander would dispatch a rider. That courier would not be riding all the way to the Grand Master. He would be riding to the nearest Templar house, where his message would be copied and forwarded along the next link in the chain. Simultaneously, the signaling tower would send a visual alert to the next commandery in the network, providing an immediate, if basic, heads-up. Within a day or two, every Templar house in the province would be aware of the situation. They could then begin to marshal resources, sending knights, crossbowmen, and supplies from multiple locations to converge on the threatened preceptory. A local baron, expecting to bully an isolated group of monks, would suddenly find himself facing a coordinated counter-move from a dozen different directions, all orchestrated by an invisible command structure that operated with a speed and unity he could not match. The network allowed the orders to concentrate force at the point of friction with breathtaking efficiency, making a localized attack a very risky proposition. Beyond military coordination, this proto-internet facilitated the lifeblood of any large organization, the efficient transfer of resources and economic intelligence. The same couriers who carried military dispatches also carried financial documents, letters of credit, and detailed reports on local market conditions. A commandery in a wine-producing region of France could send word to a preceptory in a grain-rich area of Germany, arranging a direct trade that bypassed local markets and tariffs entirely. Information about a poor harvest in one region could trigger the shipment of surplus grain from another, stabilizing the order's internal economy and preventing local famines that could weaken their position. The secure stables and guest quarters were not just for knights and soldiers, they were for the accountants, the quartermasters, the traveling treasurers who managed the order's vast and complex finances. This seamless flow of information and resources created a resilient, adaptive economic system that was immune to the disruptions that frequently crippled feudal economies. The commandery was not just a fortress and a monastery, it was a data center and a logistics hub, its architectural design ensuring that information, like water, could always find a channel to flow where it was most needed. Now we come to a principle that reveals the military monk not just as an engineer or a strategist, but as a master psychologist, a grand illusionist working in stone and mortar. The previous layers of defense were formidable, but this 11th principle introduces a chilling new dimension, architectural deception. Here, the blueprint transforms from a plan for a fortress into a script for a deadly play, where the building itself becomes an actor, feigning weakness to lure its enemies into a final, fatal act. This was not about hiding strength, it was about deliberately showcasing what looked like a flaw, a carefully crafted performance designed to exploit the predictable instincts of any attacking commander. The entire structure became a web of lies where nothing was as it seemed, and the confidence of the assailant was their greatest vulnerability. One of the most common and effective deceptions was the use of a false postern gate. On a blueprint, a small, secondary gate might be indicated in a part of the outer wall that seemed less fortified, perhaps tucked away in a shadowy corner or near a patch of rough terrain that offered cover for an approach. To a besieging army scout, this would look like a golden opportunity, a secret back door, poorly watched, a chance to sneak a small, elite force inside under cover of darkness to open the main gates from within. But the blueprint tells a different story. That inviting gate did not open into a quiet courtyard or an unguarded alley. Instead, it opened directly into a purpose-built killing court, a confined, circular space completely surrounded by high, windowless walls. The moment the assault party rushed through the gate, the portcullis behind them would slam down, trapping them inside. Then, from every direction, from dozens of concealed arrow slits carved into the surrounding walls at multiple heights, a storm of crossbow bolts would rain down. There was no cover, no retreat, and no advance. The secret entrance was in reality a slaughterhouse, a meticulously engineered death trap that turned the enemy's own stealth and aggression against them in the most devastating way possible. The deception extended even to the very walls an attacker might choose to scale. A savvy besieger would often look for sections of the curtain wall that appeared older, weaker, or less meticulously maintained. The blueprints show that the military monks sometimes created these weak spots intentionally. A section of wall might be built with a slightly different colored stone or with less mortar, making it look like a repaired breach or a shoddy construction job. An attacker, seeing this, would direct their sappers or siege ladder crews toward this apparent vulnerability, but the reality behind that wall was a nightmare. Sometimes the wall was structurally unsound by design, built with a fragile core so that when enough weight was applied by ladders and climbing men, it would collapse inward, burying the attackers in a heap of rubble. In a more fiendish variation, the space immediately behind that seemingly vulnerable wall section might be a narrow corridor housing the Commandery's main bakery or forge. The constant heat from the massive ovens or the blacksmith's fire would seep into the stone, making that part of the outer wall noticeably warmer to the touch. A climber pressing his body against it, expecting cold stone, would instead find a searing surface causing panic, burns, and a swift retreat. What looked like a structural flaw was in fact a thermal weapon. This psychological warfare reached its zenith in the design of the approach to the main gate itself. We've already discussed the defensively brilliant, twisting entrance ramp at a place like Krak des Chevaliers. But some blueprints indicate an even deeper layer of trickery involving the drawbridge and gatehouse. A common tactic for breaking a gate was the use of a battering ram. To protect against this, many castles built a wooden hoarding, a covered gallery that projected out from the top of the wall over the gate, allowing defenders to drop stones and burning materials directly onto the ram and its crew. The military monks, however, occasionally designed a false hoarding. This structure would look identical to a real one from a distance, but it was built with a deliberate, hidden weakness. The moment a heavy battering ram was positioned directly beneath it, defenders inside the gatehouse would release a mechanism. The entire false hoarding, laden with pre-stacked rocks and barrels of burning pitch, would collapse catastrophically downward, crushing the ram and its crew in a single, shocking ambush from above. The attackers believed they were assaulting a defended gate, but they were actually standing directly under a pre-positioned avalanche, triggered the instant they committed to their attack. The ultimate goal of all this architectural theater was to weaponize the attacker's own decision-making process. A commander laying siege to a standard castle could rely on established principles of warfare. He could assess the height of the walls, the depth of the moat, and the number of towers to formulate a viable plan. But when facing a commandery built by the military monks, all such assessments became untrustworthy. The very process of reconnaissance became a potential trap. Was that a real weak point in the wall or an invitation to disaster? Was that a careless sentry on the battlement or a paid actor designed to look inattentive? This constant, gnawing uncertainty created a paralysis of analysis. It forced commanders to second-guess every observation, to doubt the evidence of their own eyes. It bred caution where aggression was needed, and it could provoke reckless assaults where patience was the wiser course. The fortress, through its deceptive design, was actively manipulating the enemy's mind, eroding their confidence and forcing them into errors they would never make against a straightforward opponent. The stones were not just defending, they were lying, and in that lie they found a power far greater than their mere physical strength. It might seem like a vast leap from the stone battlements of a medieval commandery to the gleaming, glass-fronted lobby of a modern corporate headquarters, but the strategic DNA is strikingly similar. The principles of security honed over centuries by the military monks did not vanish with the age of plate armor and broadswords. They evolved, translating from the language of stone and mortar into the vocabulary of concrete, steel, and digital surveillance. This enduring legacy is most vividly apparent in the widespread adoption of layered defense, a core concept we saw in the concentric walls of Krak des Chevaliers. Today, this principle defines the security of nearly every major airport in the world. Your journey from the curb to your airplane seat is a carefully choreographed passage through a series of defensive rings. It begins at the perimeter with vehicle checkpoints and barriers designed to stop car bombs, a modern equivalent of a moat. You then pass into the public area of the terminal, which is the equivalent of the outer bailey, a controlled but accessible space. Next, you reach the crucial, heavily fortified choke point, the security screening area. This is the modern gatehouse, complete with its own portcullis in the form of metal detectors and X-ray machines, and its own murder holes, which are the watchful eyes of TSA agents and high-definition cameras scanning for threats. Once you pass through this, you enter the sterile concourse, the inner ward, where movement is still monitored but the immediate threat level is considered lower. This systematic, layered approach to controlling access and breaking down a potential threat into manageable segments is a direct descendant of the medieval blueprint, proving that the fundamental geometry of security remains constant even as the weapons change. This architectural philosophy is formalized in a modern discipline known as crime prevention through environmental design, or CTED. This approach, now taught to urban planners, architects, and police forces worldwide, is essentially a codification of the intuitive intelligence practiced by the military monks. One of its central tenets is natural surveillance, the idea that spaces should be designed to allow legitimate users to easily observe their surroundings, thereby discouraging criminal activity. The medieval monks achieved this with their high towers and strategically placed arrow slits, giving sentinels a commanding view of the approaches and courtyards. In a modern context, this translates into the open, well-lit design of a public park, where clear sightlines allow people to see deep into the space, or the use of low hedges and large windows in a building's facade, eliminating hiding spots and creating a sense that someone could always be watching. The military monks understood that an attacker feels most confident in shadow and concealment. Modern security design uses light and open space to strip that confidence away, creating an environment where malicious intent feels exposed and vulnerable. Another pillar of CTED, and a clear echo of the Commandery blueprint, is the concept of territorial reinforcement. The medieval fortress used its imposing walls, gatehouses, and even its decorative carvings to create a powerful, unambiguous statement. This is our space. You are entering our domain. This psychological demarcation is crucial for security. It creates a sense of ownership and responsibility among the defenders or legitimate users, while simultaneously triggering a subconscious alertness in outsiders. We see this principle alive today in the subtle and not so subtle cues of modern architecture. A corporate campus might use a change in pavement texture, a low wall, or a specific style of landscaping to define its boundary, creating a psychological threshold even without a physical barrier. A residential neighborhood might use a shared architectural style, distinctive streetlights, and community gardens to reinforce a collective identity and a sense of territorial control, making a stranger or a potential burglar feel more conspicuous. This is the modern equivalent of the intimidating facade of a Templar Preceptory, using design to communicate control and watchfulness without a single spoken word. The control of access points, so brilliantly executed in the multi-stage gatehouses of old, is another area where the medieval mind has directly shaped the modern world. The military monks knew that a gate was not a simple door. It was a complex filtering mechanism, a place to slow down, inspect, and control the flow of people and goods. Today, this philosophy is embedded in the design of everything from high-security government buildings to stadiums and concert venues. The use of man-traps, double-door systems where the second door only opens once the first has closed and the person inside has been verified, is a direct technological descendant of the portcullis and killing corridor. It creates a contained space where a potential threat can be isolated and neutralized. The strategic placement of reception desks and security booths in modern lobbies forces all visitors to approach from a specific, controlled angle under observation, much like the twisting entrance ramp of a castle forced knights to expose their unshielded sides. Even the ubiquitous badge access system for employees is a digital manifestation of the secret signs and passwords that would have been required to gain entry to the inner sanctums of a commandery. The goal remains identical: to create a series of verified checkpoints that separate authorized individuals from potential threats, using the architecture itself to enforce the protocol. Perhaps the most profound and subtle inheritance from these ancient strategists is the use of design as a psychological tool. The military monks were masters of this, using the sheer grandeur of their cathedrals to inspire awe and fear, and using deceptive features to sow doubt and confusion. Modern security architecture has learned this lesson well. Consider the design of a major bank headquarters. Its facade is often made of vast, imposing sheets of marble and glass, projecting an image of solidity, permanence, and unassailable strength, a clear message to deter even the thought of an attack. This is the psychological warfare of the cathedral spire, updated for the corporate age. Conversely, in environments where the goal is to create a sense of calm and order, like a modern airport terminal, architects use soaring, vaulted ceilings and abundant natural light. While these elements are aesthetically pleasing, they also serve a strategic purpose. They reduce feelings of claustrophobia and agitation in a stressful travel environment, making crowds easier to manage and less likely to panic. The design is actively managing the emotional state of the people within it, just as the sacred geometry of a chapel was intended to bolster the morale and resolve of its defenders. By studying the strategic intelligence of the military monks, we gain more than just a historical curiosity. We acquire a deep, timeless insight into the human psyche. We learn that the most effective security is not just about physical barriers and surveillance cameras, but about creating spaces that are inherently secure by their very design, spaces that guide behavior, deter malice through psychology, and function seamlessly, proving that the principles forged in the fire of the Middle Ages are just as relevant in the silent, digital battles of the 21st century. And so we arrive at the final, unshakable core of the entire commandery, the ultimate expression of the military monastic ethos where the spiritual and the strategic become one and the same. If the concentric walls were the fortress's muscle and the gatehouses its teeth, then the sanctuary was its indomitable heart and soul. Tucked away within the deepest, most protected part of the complex, the chapel was far more than a place for daily prayers. It was designed from the outset as the final redoubt, the last line of defense where the brothers would make their ultimate stand. Unrolling the blueprints, this intention is immediately clear. While other sections of the commandery show walls of respectable thickness, the lines denoting the sanctuary's walls are often dramatically heavier, sometimes double or even triple the width. This was the commandery's internal citadel, a fortress within a fortress, built to withstand a level of punishment that would have reduced the outer defenses to rubble. Its position was not arbitrary. It was almost always centrally located and often built upon the highest natural ground within the compound, or its foundations were deliberately raised to give it an elevated command. This served a dual, brilliant purpose. Spiritually, it physically represented the centrality of faith in their lives, the literal and figurative high point of their community. Strategically, it provided the defenders within with a panoramic, commanding view of the entire complex. From the sanctuary's elevated windows or its own fortified tower, the commander could witness the flow of the battle across every courtyard and wall, directing the final stages of the defense even as the enemy poured through the breached outer gates. This architectural commitment to final defense is breathtakingly evident in the sanctuary's practical provisions for a prolonged last stand. The blueprints frequently reveal a feature that seems almost miraculous in a besieged fortress: an independent, protected water source located within the chapel itself. In some commanderies, this was a deep, stone-lined well sunk directly through the chapel floor, its access covered by a heavy slab that could be sealed shut. In others, it was a massive, hidden cistern vaulted beneath the altar or the sacristy, filled by a dedicated, concealed rainwater channel that was entirely separate from the complex's main water supply. This ensured that even if the enemy poisoned the central well or cut the main aqueduct, the defenders in the redoubt would have a secure supply of drinking water to sustain them for weeks. Alongside this, the plans often show small, heavily fortified storage chambers adjoining the sanctuary, designed to hold emergency supplies of hardtack, dried meat, and grain. The sanctuary was not just a strong room for the spirit, it was a stocked survival bunker, meticulously prepared to outlast any other part of the Commandery. Its sheer physical mass and these self-sustaining features sent an unambiguous message to both defender and attacker alike. It declared that the fall of the outer walls was not the end of the battle, but merely the beginning of its final, most desperate and sacred phase. When that dreaded moment arrived and the outer defenses were overwhelmed, the retreat to the sanctuary was not a rout. It was a deliberate, disciplined tactical maneuver, a controlled contraction of the Commandery's defensive perimeter. The surviving brothers would fall back through a series of pre-planned choke points, often destroying temporary barricades or even collapsing corridors behind them to slow the enemy's pursuit. Their goal was to funnel the remaining fighting strength into the sanctuary, sealing its massive, iron-banded doors and lowering its final portcullis. Once inside, the nature of the defense transformed completely. The brothers were no longer defending a sprawling military base. They were defending their church, the most sacred ground they knew. The very space they stood in was charged with profound spiritual significance. The same stone walls that provided physical protection were also adorned with fading frescoes of martyrs and saints, men who had faced death for their faith. The air, thick with the smell of old incense and cold stone, was a tangible reminder of their vows and their purpose. This environment acted as a powerful psychological fortifier. The fear and chaos of the battle outside were replaced by a grim, resolute calm. For these men, to die here was not a failure. It was a form of martyrdom, a final testament to their unwavering commitment. The sanctuary, therefore, provided the one thing a secular fortress could not: an unbreakable morale that turned a last stand into a holy act. The architectural layout of the sanctuary itself was often subtly engineered to aid this final defense. While maintaining its primary function as a place of worship, its features doubled as defensive assets. The tall, narrow stained glass windows, set high in the walls, were impossible for an attacker to climb through but provided excellent ventilation and light for the defenders. The sturdy stone altar could be used as a central command post or a barricade. The choir loft, accessed by a narrow, easily defended staircase, became a perfect elevated platform for archers and crossbowmen, giving them a clear field of fire over the entire nave below. Every pillar, every recess, every step was familiar territory to the brothers, who had prayed in this space every day for years. They knew its every echo and shadow, turning the sacred geometry of their chapel into a tactical map. An attacker forcing his way through the main door would find himself in an unfamiliar, reverberant space, potentially disoriented and backlit by the entrance, while the defenders moved with the confidence of those fighting on home ground, a ground they were prepared to consecrate with their blood. In the end, the sanctuary as the ultimate redoubt represents the perfect culmination of the military monastic identity. It was the physical guarantee that their spiritual mission would endure even in the face of total military collapse. The design ensured that the very last thing to fall, if it fell at all, would be the symbol of their faith. This was the ultimate strategic depth. It meant that an enemy could never truly claim victory until they had shattered the Commandery's soul, a task that often proved far more difficult than breaching its walls. The sanctuary stood as a silent promise that their cause, embodied in that final, unyielding core of stone and faith, was literally built to outlast any storm. It was a declaration that for these warrior monks, there was no final retreat, only a transition to a different, more profound kind of battlefield, where the stones themselves seemed to pray alongside the defenders, and every arrow shot was a final, defiant psalm. For centuries, the secrets of the military monks were locked in crumbling stone and fading parchment, their full strategic depth just beyond our grasp. We could walk the ruins and marvel at the walls, but the living, breathing intelligence of the Commandery, how it truly functioned as a unified defensive organism, remained shrouded in mystery. That is, until now. Today, we are witnessing a revolution in historical understanding, a new era powered not by the chisel and the compass, but by the laser and the processor. The field of digital archaeology is throwing open doors we never knew existed, allowing us to step inside these ancient fortresses as they were meant to be seen, turning centuries of scholarly hypothesis into verifiable digital fact. The key to this revival is a technology called LiDAR, which stands for light detection and ranging. Imagine being able to strip away an entire forest with the push of a button, revealing the perfectly preserved foundation of a Templar Preceptory hidden for centuries beneath the undergrowth. That is the magic of LiDAR. Mounted on aircraft or drones, these laser scanners fire millions of invisible pulses of light at the ground. By measuring the time it takes for each pulse to bounce back, they create an exquisitely detailed three-dimensional map of the Earth's surface, ignoring trees and vegetation to show only the solid topography below. For archaeologists, this is like gaining X-ray vision. They are discovering lost commanderies, tracing the ghostly outlines of long-vanished outer walls, and identifying ancient road systems that connected these nodes in the military monastic network, all from the air. This data provides the raw, precise skeleton upon which the digital flesh of the fortress can be rebuilt. Once the LiDAR data and traditional archaeological surveys are gathered, the next stage of the miracle occurs inside sophisticated three-dimensional modeling software. Here, historians and digital artists collaborate in a virtual space, using the original fragmented blueprints, architectural treatises, and the physical evidence from the ruins themselves to reconstruct the Commandery stone by virtual stone. This is far more than just creating a pretty picture. It is an act of rigorous, evidence-based resurrection. Every buttress is placed according to the load it must bear. Every arrow slit is angled based on the mathematical principles of defense. The result is a dynamic, interactive model that can be explored from any angle, from a bird's-eye view of the entire complex to a ground-level perspective of a knight standing watch on the battlements. For the first time, we are no longer outsiders looking at a ruin. We are inhabitants walking the hallways of a fully restored fortress. This virtual environment becomes a powerful laboratory for testing the strategic hypotheses we have discussed throughout this journey. Take the principle of layered defense and the killing zone. A historian can now populate the digital model with virtual attackers and defenders. They can run a siege simulation, programming the AI to assault the gatehouse. The simulation can calculate the trajectories of arrows from every arrow slit, model the effectiveness of boiling oil poured from the murder holes, and demonstrate with chilling clarity how an attacking force would be systematically dismantled in the confined space between the outer and inner walls. These are not just animations, they are computational experiments that provide quantitative data on the defensive efficiency of the design, proving definitively that these were not just tall walls, but intelligently engineered death traps. The digital models also allow for a precise analysis that was previously impossible, the study of strategic sightlines. With the click of a mouse, a researcher can stand in the shoes of a sentry in the highest tower. The software can then render a panoramic view, exactly as that sentry would have seen it, calculating the precise distance to the horizon and identifying any blind spots in the terrain. They can then move to an arrow slit on the outer wall and determine the exact killing ground that a single archer could control. This ability to see through the eyes of the medieval defender confirms the incredible forethought in the placement of every tower and every opening. It reveals how the entire landscape was incorporated into a cohesive defensive web, where observation and fields of fire were meticulously planned to leave no approach safe for an enemy. Perhaps one of the most astonishing applications of this technology is in the realm of acoustic archaeology. We have discussed how the military monks may have used the soundscapes of their commanderies for communication and intelligence. Now we can prove it. Using the precise dimensions and materials data from the digital model, audio engineers can simulate the acoustic properties of these stone spaces. They can place a virtual sound source, a whispered word in the choir loft of the chapel, and map how that sound wave would travel through the vaulted ceilings and stone corridors. The results have been revelatory. In several modeled commanderies, clear acoustic channels have been identified, pathways where a whisper could indeed travel dozens of yards with remarkable clarity, directly to a specific guard post or the commander's quarters. This digitally validated the theory of silent communication, revealing an invisible network of sound that turned the entire fortress into a whispering gallery, a secret weapon that was there all along, waiting for the right technology to let us hear its echo. This technological revival is doing more than just confirming old ideas. It is constantly revealing new, subtle intricacies that were completely invisible to us before. For instance, a digital analysis of the stress points in a vaulted ceiling might reveal that a particular pattern of stonework wasn't merely decorative, but was actually a clever structural solution to distribute weight away from a hidden postern gate below. The simulation of water flow through the complex's drainage channels might show how the system was designed not just for sanitation, but to intentionally flood a specific section of the moat during a siege, creating a deeper, more formidable obstacle at a critical point. The digital lens is allowing us to see the micro-intelligence within the macro design, the layer upon layer of considered thought that these architect monks invested in every single aspect of their creations. In a profound twist of history, the digital age, with all its silicon and code, is giving us our clearest window yet into the medieval mind. We are moving beyond educated guesses and entering a realm of digital certainty. We can now understand not just what they built, but why they built it that way. We can test their strategies, walk their walls, and hear their secrets. The silent stones are finally speaking, not in a language of worn inscriptions, but in the universal tongue of data and simulation. This is not the end of the story of the military monks. It is a thrilling new beginning, a renaissance of understanding where every scan and every simulation peels back another layer of time, bringing us face to face with the breathtaking strategic genius of those who believed that to build for God, one must also build